Good morning, everybody. We'll be getting started here shortly.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Michelle Conrad, and as co-chair of this study, I'd like to welcome everyone to our third public information gathering meeting of the National Academy Committee on Impacts on Shipping and Commercial, Tribal, and Recreational Fisheries from Development of Renewable Energy on the West Coast. Next slide. National Academies is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that is the nation's preeminent source of expert, evidence-based, and objective advice on science, engineering, and health matters. The National Academies provides independent, objective advice to inform policy with scientific findings, spark progress and innovation, and confront challenging issues for the benefit of society. Before diving into today's session, I would also like to review our expectations for conduct. The National Academies are committed to the principles of integrity, civility, and respect in all of our activities. We look to all participants to be a partner in this commitment by helping us to maintain a professional and cordial environment. All forms of discrimination, harassment, and bullying are prohibited in any National Academies activity. You can read the full policy on the public website. Next slide. This committee has been formed to produce a consensus report based on our statement of tasks, which you can see here. The committee has been tasked to document historical and current uses of the offshore areas of the West Coast, including commercial, recreational, and tribal fishing, tribal, usual, and custom fishing areas, and historic, current, and potential future shipping lanes. Additionally, the committee will analyze Coast Guard operations related to fishing activities, anticipated interactions between maritime activity and the placement of offshore renewable energy infrastructure, and anticipated benefits and methods to mitigate impacts through siting, design, and planning of renewable energy development. The committee will review current decision-making processes and provide recommendations. The statement of tasks can also be found on the project's website. Next slide. This slide shows the committee's membership. Their bios can be found on our webpage. I would like to emphasize that this committee is non-governmental and these members are volunteer experts. Additionally, comments from members of the committee should not be interpreted as positions of the committee or of the Academy. Committee members typically ask probing questions in these information gathering sessions that may not be indicative of their personal views, the views of the committee, or their position regarding findings or recommendations for the final report. Next slide. The agenda for today is shown here. The purpose of the meeting is to gather information on the different forms of offshore renewable energy found on the West Coast, hear from various fishery stakeholders and community groups on potential impacts. And now we will hear from a couple of speakers on the California current shifting fish toss. We have with us Drs. Jamil Samori and Owen Liu. Jamil is with the Northwest Fisheries Science Center, and he's one of the co-leads of the Integrated Ecosystem Assessment Team. And with him is Dr. Owen Liu with the University of Washington. Welcome.
Thank you. Process check. Well, let me say good morning. I'm Jamil Samori at the Northwest Fisheries Science Center. I'm Owen Wood, research scientist here at the University of Washington.
And then it looks like you've answered my process check question, which is, will we present our slides? You're gonna get us started.
Great. Thanks for having us today. We're really excited to be here. As I just said, I'm a researcher at the University of Washington, but until recently, I was working at NOAA with Jamil on a lot of these sorts of issues, thinking about where fish might be now and in the future, and what impacts that might have on fisheries on the West Coast in the California current. So next slide, please. So this is what we're going to try to talk about. There's obviously, this is a huge topic, and I'm excited to go first today. Obviously, I think you guys are going to hear from a lot of different experts with a ton of really important considerations for this panel. And so hopefully we'll sort of set the stage a little bit this morning from a scientific perspective, and particularly, let's say, a NOAA perspective on how we think about where fish are shifting and what it might mean on a broad scale for fishing dependent communities. So we're going to talk about a little bit about where fish are shifting, what that might mean for communities, and then leave a lot of sort of time to think about key uncertainties and unknowns and important considerations from our perspective when thinking about renewable energy development. Next slide. So just to put some of our take-home points up front for you guys to have something to think about as we go through this. Climate change is causing changes in the spatial distribution of fish and their fisheries on the West Coast. An important thing we want to talk about today is that these changes are not spatially uniform and really not the same for all species. And so therefore, assessing effects of these changes on fishers requires, understanding how both the fish and the fisheries will adapt, including, switching species, expanding fishing grounds, all the things you might imagine. And that really want to emphasize that, us and our colleagues have done a good amount of work thinking about this, but it's obviously a complex, really diverse system, and understanding species responses to these changing conditions is definitely still ongoing research. And so therefore, decisions on renewable energy development will certainly involve trade-offs using imperfect information. Next slide. So I just want to motivate this a little bit today, and I think you guys will hear some really good testimonials probably later in the day. This is just one example to say sort of the future is now in some of these things that are going on the West Coast. So this is a headline from the Seattle Times from 2022. Ocean heat waves trigger squid bloom along the Pacific coast. And this is having to do with market squid that in the recent decade have made their way into Oregon waters. You see in the chart on the left just a relative change in market squid in California versus Oregon versus Washington. And really, you can see the map on the left getting hotter from 1998 to 2019, and that's just to say that in this time period around 2020, we saw many more market squid appearing in Oregon, and a fishery developed. So if we go to the next slide, this is just a quote from commercial fisherman Josh Whaley on Oregon Public Radio in 2021. And I'm just going to read it real quick because I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of what our perspective is on a lot of this. So it started out with 2 of us, and now I believe we've got somewhere around 10 or 12 of what I would call resident vessels that are participating. We're all participating in it and kind of getting our practice up, if you will, and learning this fishery. Like you said, sustaining has 2 levels. We have the resource sustainability, and we've got the business model sustainability. I believe that it's there, it being a fishery, it's just a little boom or bust. You're sometimes happy that you went into it, other times you're happy that you still have your bread and butter fisheries to continue to participate in. And I think that as we talk a lot today about adaptation and how things are changing, it's just a reminder that things are changing really quickly, and we are uncertain about how fast and how sort of directionally things are changing. And so to keep in mind this perspective that sort of people working on the water every day have to sort of deal with this level of variability. So next slide. With apologies to all of the people listed on this slide, I'm going to say this really quickly and sort of start with an overview. So from a federal perspective, we often think about species, managed species or fisheries on the West Coast as falling into 4 major groups. And that is groundfish, coastal pelagic species like sardines and anchovies, salmon fisheries, and highly migratory species, which would include things that are not fish like whales and marine mammals. And we're going to talk a little bit more in detail about groundfish in a couple of minutes, because that is the fishery that I think Jamil and I have worked most closely on in this way over the past 5 or 10 years. But I'll say quickly that there's a diversity of expected responses to future climate change amongst these groups of species. And again, to generalize a lot, there is a belief or there's evidence that coastal pelagic species like sardines and anchovies are responding in the way you sort of might expect to ocean warming, and that is moving their center of distribution northward as ocean waters warm. For species like salmon, you can see on the bottom left there, there are obviously lots of different stocks, and salmon are attached to their natal rivers, right, where they were born. And so the responses to future climate change may be a little bit more complex. You can see this is an image from our colleague Oli Shelton's paper from 2021 showing that you can see these little lines, but in those Klamath and Lower Columbia, in cool years, they shifted. You can see a little bit of a shift in the proportion of the stock that was found about one river or one region south of where they normally would be during cold years, which is what you might expect. But for that San Francisco Bay stock, they actually shifted a little bit northward in cooler years. And that is a combination of the way that I think that the ecosystem works as a coastal upwelling system and different areas along the coast that have cool or warm waters, even if there are warmer waters offshore. And then highly migratory species, our colleague Nerea Lozama Ochoa at the University of California, Santa Cruz, wrote a paper, and she found 2 major groupings for highly migratory species. So these include, on the left, things like marine mammals. Most of the marine mammals, the expectation in the future was that in this plot, redder is a decrease in habitat suitability. So some of the prediction here is that the habitat for marine mammals will be closer to shore in that sort of cool upwelled water along the coast of the West Coast here, and that some of that offshore area may become less suitable habitat. But then for some of these ectotherms shown on the right there, like sharks and leatherback sea turtles, that there actually may be an expansion of suitable habitat along the West Coast in the future. So that went really fast. I expect to have some conversation about this as we go forward, but as I said, I think we're gonna talk a little bit more about groundfish for the next few slides. So next. So I think I've worked a lot on groundfish and projecting their species distributions under climate change. One of the motivating species here is sablefish. I know some in this room are much more familiar than me with sablefish, but this is a really important commercial fishery on the West Coast. It is caught with a variety of gears, but often with bottom trawls, which is what I focused on. And sablefish, also known as black cod, is famous for this miso black cod dish that you see here that is delicious. But what we did for a bunch of different species, including sablefish, we built species distribution models. So these are statistical models based on past and projected future temperature and dissolved oxygen. And then we projected these species distributions out to the year 2100 using downscale versions of the IPCC climate model outputs. And you can see on the bottom left here, this is, say, a description of an environmental niche for a sablefish. They like, cold bottom temperatures and can tolerate relatively low dissolved oxygen levels. And so we use that information, if you go to the next slide, to project where they might be in the future. And so let me orient you to this plot real quick. On the top, there are 4 species across the panel. So this is Dover sole, a flatfish, sablefish, short spine and long spine thorny heads. And on the top, this is showing a projected under 3 different future climate scenarios, the change in the distance from shore of the center of the distribution. And it's kind of organized from north to south there. So latitude is on the y-axis. And you can see that in general, we project that these fish will be distributed, or the center of their distribution will be shifted offshore by anywhere from 5 to 20 kilometers, which is certainly a meaningful distance if you are a fisher that is paying for fuel and have to go further offshore to find your fish. The other thing I would say is that it's not, this pattern is not totally the same across all these species, right? And is definitely not the same at all areas along the coast. You can see definitely in that area, sort of north in sort of towards the area where we are now sitting in Washington, that projected shift is further. And then on the bottom, that is a description of a projected depth shift. So on the y-axis here is the proportion of the stock, if you will, that is shallower than 700 fathoms. The reason I chose 700 fathoms here is it's sort of both a regulatory and practical limit, depth limit on trawl fishing. It's so 700 fathoms is about 1,300 meters. It's quite deep and is sort of, yes, as I said, the regulatory limit of trawl fishing on the West Coast. And so you can see, so in that second panel, for example, for sablefish, the projection is that this stock will shift deeper, such that a good chunk of where we think the stock is distributed is actually sort of outside the depth limit of practical trawl fishing. So yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say here. Next slide, please. So moving forward to, what are the implications of these sorts of distribution shifts in groundfish and other species? We sort of conceptualized this by using current day fishing footprints. So we've used fishing dependent data. You can see on the right side here, this is for the trawl fishery that I was just describing. This is for different ports on the West Coast. This is a description of sort of where the vessels out of each of those ports go fishing. In general, in a time averaged way, you can see a couple of, these might be outdated by now, but a couple of the proposed wind energy areas superimposed there on the right. And then a projection again for sablefish on the catch per unit effort or fishing efficiency, if you will, for vessels out of these different, or within these fishing footprints, sorry. So within these fishing footprints, this is the expectation for the density of sablefish and how it may change over time. Point being here that it is declining as these fish are projected to move offshore and deeper. And so that means that that fishers that are targeting this fish will likely have to make a decision about, whether to follow this fish stock, whether to, switch to a different fishery. And obviously that this sort of distribution shift will, bring these fish distributions into more or less contact with, proposed renewable energy areas. And I think this is where I may hand it off. Next slide.
Thank you, Owen. Yeah, that's a perfect segue to the question on this screen here about how might fishers adapt to these shifting stocks. And on an earlier slide that Owen presented, there was a quote from Josh Whaley, a commercial fisherman in Oregon, in response to the movement of market squid. And in that quote, he refers to bread and butter fisheries that kind of are what the commercial fishermen rely upon for consistent source of income. And part of the reason that we focused on groundfish in today's presentation is that that's just what it is. It is one of those bread and butter fisheries that can be fished year round and typically be found relatively close to shore. And so, and it's not migrating in and out of the system. So we're particularly curious about the fate of these shifting stocks and how fishers may adapt to the bread and butter fisheries. And what Owen has shown is that there's clear evidence that groundfish stocks are responsive to projected changes in ocean temperature and ocean oxygen that's expected in the future to the end of the century. And that these changes in the distribution of the stocks will shift their availability to commercial fisheries on the West Coast. And that some fishing grounds will show a bigger shift than others. And so that brings up this question, well, how might we respond? And so with colleagues, we have introduced, if you don't mind switching to the next slide, two alternative hypotheses for assessing the risk to fishers of these shifting stock distributions. And in particular, we've thought about their potential to enhance the flexibility dimension of adaptive capacity. On the left, one hypothesis is that they may adapt in place. So essentially, they may keep the same fishing grounds they're in today, but switch the species they're targeting based on their relative availability. Pretty straightforward hypothesis that really focuses on fishing portfolios and how diversified they are and which species they're targeting. On the right, we have an alternative, which is not necessarily mutually exclusive, which we're calling adapt on the move. And in this case, the hypothesis is rather than shifting the species that they're fishing for, they'll follow the fish by expanding their fishing grounds to the new locations. For example, in the figures that Owen shared, the sablefish are predicted to shift offshore and deeper. So this would be folks that decided to follow those fish offshore and deeper. So what we did is we evaluated the potential for adapting in place or adapting on the move to mitigate risk of bottom trawl groundfish fisheries to climate change based on consideration of their exposure to climate change, as well as their sensitivity, here quantified as their economic dependence on groundfish. Next slide, please. And so just to dive into the details a little bit here, on the left, I'm showing you the fishing footprints over the 2010 to 2020 decade roughly of the bottom trawl groundfish fishery on the West Coast. The far left panel is the full coast, and then there are insets for portions of the coast in the right three panels. And so what Owen has done is actually predicted the shifts of groundfish species in relation to these groundfish fishing footprints. In this paper here, what we did is we used downscaled Earth system model climate projections to quantify how much ocean temperatures were likely to change within those fishing grounds and how far a vessel might need to travel to find the same temperature regime in the future as two ways of indexing the amount of exposure that these fishers have to climate change. And then on the right panel, what we're showing is the economic dependence of groundfish vessels in each of the 14 port groups shown on the left to the economic dependence of these groundfish vessels on groundfish themselves relative to other species. And so on the far left, there are port groups like Santa Barbara and Los Angeles, where very little of the income from commercial fishing is derived from groundfish. And then ports on the right, like Fort Bragg, Puget Sound, and Astoria, where the vast majority of commercial fishing income is derived from groundfish caught with bottom trawl. And as you can see, the more northern ports are more economically dependent on groundfish. That's that positive relationship in the right panel. And not shown here, but based on results that Owen showed earlier, it's also true that the more northern ports are more exposed to the predicted impacts of climate change. So this sets up the idea that northern ports, groundfish vessels fishing out of northern ports are going to be a greater risk from climate change in the future. If you go to the next slide, please. We also evaluated the potential for portfolio diversification, that adaptive play strategy, or mobility, that adapt on the move strategy, to mitigate the risk due to exposure and economic dependence on groundfish. And what we found, as you can see on the figure on the right, is that more northern ports are characterized by vessels that are able to travel farther to catch their fish. And so this suggests that more northern ports have the capacity to expand fishing grounds in a way that more southern ports are less able to do so, given the current assets available to the fishery at the moment. And so, in short, we find that higher mobility is likely to dampen risk due to climate change for these more northern groundfish ports. However, because they are more exposed and more economically dependent on groundfish, the more northern ports are still at greater risk than more southern ports to climate change. Next slide, please. So we've done our best to develop insights into what climate change may portend for groundfish fisheries on the West Coast in the future. There's still much more to be done. In particular, the groundfish fishery management plan that the Pacific Fishery Management Council is responsible for includes almost 100 different species. Owen mentioned several like Dover sole, sablefish, and thornyhead. It also includes dozens and dozens of rockfish species. And all of these species are going to be showing greater or lesser variation in the response to environmental change. And as a result, there's going to be a shift in the ecological interactions that occur between those species, predator-prey relationships, competition for habitat, and other factors. And that will modify the predictions that we're making now in ways that we can't be certain about yet, and probably won't be certain about until we're able to empirically measure what's occurring. In addition, because there are multiple species redistributing at the same time, that's going to affect the way that commercial fisheries are able to adapt, because it's going to change the overlap between species that are caught together by the same gears or caught as bycatch in fisheries, or targeted by fishers as they shift their fishing portfolios or don't shift them and expand their fishing grounds. In addition, point 3 here, one topic that we haven't really delved into is that we're expecting that the impacts of shifting stocks on fishing fleets on the West Coast to be pretty variable depending on the socioeconomic characteristics of particular vessels or even individual fishermen. In economics, we refer to this as distributional impacts, and that's what we're talking about here. We haven't assessed the extent to which, for example, smaller vessels with less capital and assets will be able to make decisions to diversify the species that they target or move to new fishing grounds. And finally, a big unknown is that we're unsure about the constraints on the speed and extent of feasible adaptation. Part of this relies on the governance context, which is highly unpredictable. But in addition to the governance context, there's also the ability of individual fishermen or fishing communities to self-organize and to learn new approaches, new technologies to be developed and adapted to cope with the shifting fish stocks. Next slide. So what does this all mean for your charge here as a panel focused on the impacts of renewable energy on, among other things, commercial fisheries? And in short, the way that individual species and collections of species, as well as fisheries, respond to shifts in distribution is going to really affect the way that renewable energy interact. So on the left, if we start there, this is a framework developed by Nerea Luzama Ochoa and colleagues who Owen mentioned earlier in the context of the highly migratory species. And what Nerea has done here is develop kind of a 4-quadrant summary that is based on the historical habitat suitability on the y-axis and the future habitat suitability on the x-axis. And I want to draw your attention to the lower right quadrant where it says new interaction. So this is a situation where the historical habitat suitability, or where we might find the species today, is going to be different than where we might find that species tomorrow, or more to the point, in 10, 20, or 50 years from now. And the reason this is an important framework in the context of renewable energy development is that there's likely to be a commitment that spans decades if renewable energy is developed in the ocean. And if the basis for reducing conflict between existing ocean uses and renewable energy development is today's species distributions, any species that fall into that lower right quadrant are going to be misassessed. Because by the time we get 10, 15, 20 years down the road, they're going to be in new locations and may come into contact with where renewable energy is happening. So it's an important consideration. It's also a really thorny problem, and I want to be honest about that because there's uncertainty around the predicted shifts in stock distributions. But this framework is perhaps useful for considering how to develop sort of a no regrets approaches to renewable energy development. And on the right, focusing more on the fisher adaptation side, as I provided an overview, we have this idea that, among other things, fishers may decide to switch the species that they're targeting based on their availability in today's fishing grounds, or they may decide to follow the fish, expanding their fishing grounds to where fish go. And just like Owen started our presentation with an empirical example of what's already happened with market squid on the West Coast shifting north, I wanted to close with the example of albacore tuna commercial passenger fishing vessel landings over the last several decades. And you don't have to look at the details here, but the x-axis shows time. And what it shows is that in the early 2000s to 2010 or so, those red bars, most of the landings were coming from California. In the last 10, 15 years, the blue bars, most of the landings have occurred right here in the state of Washington. And so this is a situation that feels a bit more like a follow the fish, that the albacore tuna have shifted their distributions north, that the fisheries are operating farther north. And so they've been able to do this because there are relatively little constraints on use of the ocean. If instead there was a context in which there was renewable energy development that prevented access to certain parts of the ocean for albacore fishing, that could lead to a different pattern in a figure like this and a different result in terms of fishing opportunities for commercial fisheries. Next slide, please. I just want to wrap up here and make sure we have plenty of time for dialogue, because I'm sure that all of you have questions, whether they're clarifying or on topics we didn't have a chance to dive into completely. But just to sum up with a slide that Owen showed at the beginning, it's very clear that climate change is causing changes in the spatial distribution of a whole range of fish, ranging from the groundfish we've taken a deep dive with today to others like highly migratory coastal pelagic species and salmon on the West Coast. This is causing impacts to fisheries already, and we're seeing those results as highlighted with the market squid and albacore examples, but we're also projecting that there are likely to be bigger impacts in more northern ports for fishers that are targeting groundfish because of the greater exposure to climate change in today's fishing grounds and their high economic dependence on groundfish. However, assessing what these effects will really be requires understanding how fishers will adapt. There's a lot of uncertainty around and a lot of considerations that they have to make as they plan their businesses. And so future work to better understand what they have done in the past, what they might do in the future, will really help to improve our insights on how species responses to changing ocean conditions will affect commercial fisheries on the West Coast, and in turn, how that will influence the perceived value of decisions around renewable energy development from a fisheries perspective. And of course, those decisions are going to have to be made with imperfect information. I want to leave it there and open the floor for discussion and question for both Owen and myself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. Question for Neil and Ellen? Yeah, so if folks could, raise their hand and online, you would find your hand raise feature in the React, button. And folks in the room, either raise your hand or turn up your, name card. So I have Dave, and then I have Steve.
First, I'd like to compliment you. It was an extraordinary presentation. For myself, as an oceanographer and fisheries person, that you guys really did a stellar job. And I admire your work and that of the colleagues that you work with. So I just want to preface my question with that. We're confronted with a huge question, just like we all are, in terms of climate variability and change and the potential of offshore renewable energy. There's a couple of things that strike me as interesting and lead up to my question. And those are that climate change and climate variability have a time scale of anywhere from decades to centuries. Offshore renewable energy is put there over a period of years and may have a duration of 20 to 40 years or so. I don't know how long it stays in the water. But there's that time scale. There's another time scale that involves the fisheries, which are the mortgages and the loans and the capitalization of the fishery. You mentioned sizes of boats. And it makes for a complex situation to make predictions in. But my question to you, and it's outside of your box a little bit, is what do you think the government can do to mitigate if offshore renewable energy were to go in the water, large windmills as an example? What do you think the government might do to mitigate the potential changes that you talked about? Now, this is more of a social science question in a way, but and so you can say, I don't want to answer it, that's fine by me. But there's this interaction between climate effects and the northward movement of most forward movement of most docks, and then the rather rapid changes that occur with offshore renewable energy built up and implementation. Given those things, do we have to foster the community somehow, their development or their sustainability or their encouragement to move and adapt? Do you have any feelings about that? Once again, it's outside your wheelhouse a little bit, so I probably should have. But it's like, you seem to be a question.
That's a great question, Dave. Thank you for it. I would like to answer it in the context of what can be done to adapt in general and leave open the question of whether it's the government acting more in a top-down context or if it's individuals or communities taking action, because what I want to focus on is the dimensions of adaptive capacity and sort of what the opportunities are there. So in this presentation, I focused on flexibility, which is one dimension of adaptive capacity, and in particular, what individual boats or fishermen might do to change the species they're targeting or whether they're following on fish. There are other dimensions of adaptive capacity, like organization, learning, the assets, as well as a couple others that we could also focus on. And so, for example, just as one topic that we didn't touch on here, but could talk more about if you wish, the potential for fisheries bycatch is something that is of concern with climate change with shifting fish stocks. And there are potentially technological solutions to avoiding bycatch. There are also organizational solutions, for example, forming co-ops that pool risk to avoid bycatch limits, constraining the ability to fish so that it doesn't focus just on the individual. There are also incentives that could be provided by the government to essentially put a tax on bycatch, which then doesn't require regulations to avoid certain areas or certain species, but leads to voluntary avoidance in order to avoid the taxes. So similar approaches could be adopted in the context of renewable energy. In other words, there could be regulatory constraints imposed, or there could be incentive-based measures that are used to incentivize fishing in some places rather than others, or in some times rather than others, that might mitigate the impacts of renewable energy development that occupies space previously. It's a hard question.
Thank you. Steve?
Thank you. Great presentation. I'm Steve Jordan with Macau Drive, which is right in the heart of its blackhawk fishery right now. I'm also one of the U.S. members on the Whiting, U.S. Canada Whiting JFC. So don't tell Aaron Berger I'm going outside of the JFC to ask questions. But you know, as you're describing this northward shift, you probably are fully aware of what's going on with Whiting. And the Canadians are very demoralized because I think last year they got around 7% of their allocation, and it's getting a little worse each year. And Macaws, which are right on the border and are really southern Canadians, they're literally in the same boat. So how do you factor in this, what I see as maybe a semi-decadal shift of stocks like whiting, even to the point where the CP catcher processor sector has they're developing a EFP exempted fishing permit to be able to move south in California for their fish. So the fish are just stuck in the south, everything other than going north. So any thoughts on that, and how do you factor that into your projections and your analysis?
Sure, yeah. I think hake or whiting is a very complex system. For those less aware, the whiting fishery is really valuable. It's often one of the largest on the West Coast. And in recent years, both the US and Canadian fleets, although the stock assessment says that the stock is quite healthy, the fishery attainment has been really low, which means that for one reason or another, the fishery has not been able to find the fish, if you will. And it's sort of a big mystery. I think there's a lot of ongoing work trying to figure out why that is. And it seems to be some of the linked perhaps to some of these sort of like basin scale or decadal scale variations in oceanography. And I think that, and the other thing about hake that's really important to understand is that it's a migratory species. And so every year it is traveling north and south in the California current. And the fishery only picks up on it when it sort of reaches up here. It's sort of like more northern extent of its migration. And so the question that scientists and the fishery are trying to figure out is like, what's going on with this migration? Do we expect this to be a long-term climate change signal or some sort of cyclical thing where they'll come back? And I think we don't know yet. And I would just say that to Jamil's point, I think that migratory species are like a whole other sort of can of worms, if you will, because they have to travel through these places. And even if they're not sort of parked right where, say, renewable energy would be developed, they may have to travel through those areas, and maybe it's a lost fishing opportunity if those areas are gone. So I would say that we do not know enough about the whiting fishery yet, or the whiting sock, to say with any sort of certainty about where it might be in the future. But I would say that one thing that we're really worried about, and this goes back to Dave's question as well about timescales, like I think that we as scientists, we feel comfortable, we're getting better at what you call seasonal forecasting. So what's going to happen in the next 6 months? Our ocean models are pretty decent at that and getting better. So can we make a seasonal outlook for what this fishing season might look like? And we have reasonable confidence about, say, a 50, 80, 100-year future, right? We have a general sense for how the mean ocean conditions are changing. But it's all that stuff in the middle on the scale of 5 to 10 years that are important for fishery planning or for stock assessments or for population assessments that are a little bit less uncertain, and that's a real frontier, I think, for science, is trying to figure out how can we make decisions that are on that sort of decadal timescale with any sort of precision. And I think we're getting there, and there's a lot of exciting work, and I think maybe some people will talk about that during this workshop, but I think that we're not quite there yet. So I know that unsatisfying answer, but I thank you for asking about the whiting fishery.
And thank you for that. And so when you hear me go on and on about potential impacts, the why, here's why. So I want the committee to understand what we don't understand.
If I might just add briefly, I agree with everything Owen said, and just want to say that to your question of how, part of it was, can we separate these decadal effects from something that might be a signal of climate change? And I would just add that, yes, I think we can do that. It's analytically accessible. We would have to produce that result with some bracketing of uncertainty, because we won't know for sure, but it should be possible. And we've been capacity limited at NOAA in particular to be able to do that.
I have Brian and then Keith, and then I have a question.
I'll be brief. I suspect I know your answer, but Brian from River, thanks for your presentation. Excellent. I know you weren't trying to do a fishery economics analysis. You're providing inputs to the fishery economics analysis. I wonder, as you were assessing, and I love the whole fishery-based, geography-based, it's very specific, provides some sense of the complexity here. As you were thinking about the resiliency that might choose, chase the fish or adaptive waste strategy, if you have anything you would point us to with regard to the adaptability of the various fisheries in terms of multi-gearing and likely impacts in terms of, market consolidation, favoring smaller vessels versus larger vessels, or more likely the other way around. Anyway, just open that up if you would point us any direction now.
I'll look first. Probably the most concise responses, I could follow up with a reference list, but slightly less brief response. Yes, there's good evidence, for example, in the groundfish fishery that market consolidation has favored larger vessels because of more capital. As one specific example. We also have a range of work on the West Coast focused on fishing portfolios and diversification that lends some insight into whether the same boats or the same permit owners are fishing with multiple different gear types. So we can look to history as some guide to the capacity for boats of different sizes or boats that are operating out of different ports to employ those strategies, what that means for future behavioral changes within the fleets is a less certain thing, but let us follow up with specific reference on that also.
Yeah, to a large extent, you answered my question, which was related to how you differentiate between periodic variability and long-term trends. And so I just asked, can you point us to some references that show why you're confident in this 10 to 50 year or 100-year prediction that truly long-term trends are affecting where we're going to find fish? Because that'd be quite helpful. The periodic changes are less critical to us than these longer-term trends, since although, as Dave mentioned, the wind farms are out there 20 to 50 years, it's still influenced. That's the key question we have to answer. So if you could point us to a few papers that might be relevant to that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll briefly say, I see that Mike Jaycox, our colleague down at the Southwest Fisheries Science Center, is on the Zoom call, and I believe he will address that later today. But between Mike, Owen, and me, we'll make sure to get back to you with some references to that question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the presentation. I wanted to ask a question where your presentation, your papers, your studies have focused on kind of how fish stocks, their distributional shifts as a result of climate change. And so one of my first questions is just what's the assumption in terms of the climate change and what factors went into that analysis? So, for example, does the study assume some regular presence of offshore marine heat waves? Or the distribution shifts, like just relative to overall ocean warming?
That's a good question. For much of this work, we use these, downscale projected climate models, which, I'm gonna be quickly out of my depth here because I'm not an oceanographer or a climate modeler, but, I would say, I think that Mike Jaycox might tell you, that the climate projections don't necessarily do a great job at, predicting, say, the frequency of future marine heat waves. But that we're quite confident that they get the mean trend pretty well. And you'll see on a lot of our figures, we didn't get to dive into it too much, but we use, multiple climate projections that say bracket what we would say is expert opinion on the sort of range of potential possible futures. And so we tried to sort of not just say what's the most extreme version that could possibly happen, but can we bracket uncertainty around what we think of the future climate projections. And so I was thinking about heat waves in the last question too, because a good amount of research now, because we had this enormous marine heat wave in the last decade starting around 2014, 2015, there's been a lot of research around like, are heat waves sort of a sentinel for what future climate could look like or not? How are they the same? How are they different? And I'm not an expert on that, but I think there's a lot of useful in some of our reference lists, and I have that, but like, there are some useful findings coming out of that. But one of the things that sort of made its way into our uncertainty slide here is like marine heat waves are this sort of pulse disturbance, if you will, right? Things change really quickly in a year, and all of a sudden the ecosystem looks different. And the question is the kinds of mitigation or adaptation that comes out of that, is that the same as something that might be more spread out over 5 or 10 years of gradual change, or not? And like, how are those situations the same or different? And so I think we're still kind of thinking about whether marine heat waves now are really a good proxy, or in what ways they are for future climate change.
Thanks. I have 2 more questions. So my next question is more on your fisher behavior changes and the adapt in place or ability to move or being more mobile. And just thinking, as you gave your presentation, that it's that transition period takes time, right? And you hear fishers now go to their traditional grounds and they can't find fish. And they have to decide how much, exploratory fishing to do on that fishing trip versus come back to port and think they're gonna be there a month from now. They're just late, or they're gonna be there next year, before they decide to actually change or, follow the fish or expand their footprint, if you will. And so just thinking about, how much of that was in the study and in the presentation that you gave in terms of the either or, how long it takes to get from one to the other.
Yeah, that's a really good and grounding kind of reality check type question of like, okay, so these are potential opportunities to respond to changing distributions of stock to the ocean. But if you're planning your business, when do you decide you're committing to one or the other or both? And we did not address that explicitly in analysis. We talked about it in the discussion section for a little bit, but I think that's one think that to address that best, it would be important to use a mixed methods approach that involves talking directly with fisheries about how they plan to do this and how they might. Future, I would say that in terms of committing to one strategy or the other or both, I expect that it would be iterative, trying out a new fishing ground and seeing, oh yeah, sure, or waiting a month and seeing if the fish are in fact there. And then repeated exposure to the same thing, oh, the fish are not coming back to the spot, would lead to a decision to try expanding the kind of fishing ground. What I think is particularly interesting about the focus on groundfish is that to some extent they've been a more predictable group of species, whiting accepted species. So if they are in fact the bread and butter fishery, but fisheries may not be able to count on them being as big as they were in the past, that's gonna make it harder to try new things in other fisheries where there are more migratory species and assume risks there while managing for a safer bets for the ground.
And then, I guess just my last question, just relates to your model was looking out to like 2100, right? So, and then there's been discussion about how we may have greater certainty about the near term, right? Than we do perhaps, the middle period, if you will. And just not knowing what changes might happen, fishing behavior, governance. And just if you could speak to, I think Jamil, you mentioned this a few minutes ago, but if you could speak to a little bit, looking ahead on our ability to monitor and detect these changes and what the outlook looks like relative to continued research by the Fund Centers for acting.
That's a great question, because our models are only as good as the data that are used to build them and then ground truth them. I think what I would say is that at the agency, we're exploring a range of approaches for continuing to monitor. There's research now specifically related to energy development around what it would mean to give up areas that have been traditionally sampled or available in the sampling frame, and how that would affect uncertainty in our stock assessments, which could then influence catch advice for the fish. So that's one way. There's also kind of the technological solutions that are a bit gee whiz and super cool, like environmental DNA, which is literally just catching water, way easier than fish, and then using genetic analyses to determine not just what the abundance of one species like black cod might be like, but to get quantitative estimates of whole communities, all the ground fish, as well as salmon and highly migratory species and coastal pelagic. That's still new technology. It's got a pretty good track record already for whiting, showing that we can develop a quantitative index, and that it parallels the traditional indices that have been used from fishery independent surveys. But we're still working on establishing the relationship between old ways of monitoring and these newer, more innovative technologies. The reason I bring them up is that there's an argument to be made that you could get better, cheaper, faster results because you don't need 4 or 5 different gear types and boats that are at sea for 4 or 5 months, but rather more rapid sampling where the same sample can be exercised to assess the abundance of multiple. So even in the advent of resource constraints, it's possible that we would be able to use environmental DNA as a way to monitor. And one more thing, even in areas that may be used for energy development, that wouldn't be accessible with, say, traditional fishing gears that are used for monitoring, because you're just catching water and have a invasive approach.
Thank you. I have Jeremy.
Yeah, thanks. Both of you great presentations. Are you aware of any studies of how fishers have adapted to
fixed bottom offshore wind. Other places, in the world, could be the US East Coast, the North Sea, outside Taiwan, China. You know, where there are, wind turbines and how fishers have adapted and how that might give us some insight to how they may adapt, to floating offshore wind, on the West Coast. I can go first by saying no, I don't have a rounded understanding of that, but I think it's a really great question. And I know my colleague Kelly Andrews, who may also be on the line, has been leading some research and working with working groups both domestically and internationally to try to understand what some of those responses would look like. And so I can follow up with some more. Good, thank you very much.
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add, besides I know that there has been a decent amount of work, even I think in Europe, though it's relatively new. Just trying to have enough time to do these, really understand the dynamics of the change in the fishery. But I agree that Kelly would be a good resource.
I have Dave.
I just want to follow up on that if I could, the European experience, and Jim Bennett, formerly of the phone, to a large extent, centralized decision making and basically told the fisheries, sorry, go somewhere else. And that's not much of an answer, but that's what's been happening. And that's quite an oversimplification, but I just want to have it.
Dave.
Another off-the-wall question. I'm curious, is AI being used to look at species distributions into the future? I mean, whether forecasting, of course, is being affected, let's say, by AI, the use of AI, and but it's on a near-term timescale, 2 weeks or something like that. And but I have no idea whether it's being used to look forward in a timescale that's meaningful for the things that you talked about. Are you aware of anything like that?
I would say, in our direct sort of research sphere, no, there's not a lot of people doing that. I know that, there's a lot of excitement and interest, on the ocean modeling side. So, producing these climate models, trying to reach out that skill into that sort of medium time frame that we were just talking about. There are certainly people, taking advantage of AI to try to do that in a predictive sense. And depending on what your definition of AI is, people use a lot of, say, machine learning approaches to do these sort of species distribution models. We, or me personally, philosophically, I tend not to do that because I think it's hard to gain really strong insight out of them. So if your only goal is prediction, you can probably do a pretty good job at a lot of different timescales. But in terms of inference, understanding why we make this prediction, and therefore how can we design a regulation around our understanding of this fishery, I think it's currently much harder to do that with something like AI because you don't understand the black box, if you will. But that's kind of my own perspective.
Okay, well, if I could, one of the things that it strikes me that observations are really critical to being able to say what you told us today. And what's going to be critical if offshore renewable energy goes in the water is to measure what their effects is through further observation. And so one of the lessons that I've learned in Coffee and other places like that is observations are critical, but something that we should probably say that our observations are going to be even more critical going into the future if we want to test to see what the effect of offshore renewable energy is relative to the other effects that you talked about. It's more of a comment that can't imagine you disagree with it, but it's an important one. There has to be investment in observation, I think, and the continuity and the maintenance of it, it can't be ignored. And yeah.
I fun quickly to agree with you and say that there's a nice literature on the value of information, especially in relation to approaching of critical tipping points, which we will see some of in the kind of ocean climate atmosphere world. And increasing monitoring precision so that we're aware that they're coming, or at least can respond to them is one of the people messages I get.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation and for taking the time to answer our questions.
Thank you, thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We'll take a 5-minute break and start again at 11:15.
Sure.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. Welcome back to our session, and I would like to turn it over to Steve Donor.
Joe. So, this morning I have the privilege of introducing Rufus Arnold. Rufus is currently the vice chairman of the Macaw Tribal Council. And he's from one of the prominent fishing tribes in the community, the Macaw tribe. And, I've been connected with Rufus's family since the start of my career. I was interviewed in the old College of Fisheries building by 3 Macaws, one of them being his dad's uncle, and Ty Parker, and offered the job. But my very first trip to the Bay when I was a student here after Galley Coast Guard, the first person I met was his grandfather, and so that was kind of the start of the connection. So Rufus went off to the bright lights of the university in Maryland, and then came home and is really doing a lot for the top people in his community. I worked with him on fishing. Michelle knows his dad, Greg Arnold, who was active on the Macaw Tribal Council for many years and fisheries. So not sure all the things Rufus is going to talk about, but it'll be interesting. Go ahead, Rufus.
So thanks for that, Steve. I guess I'm not very sure either. I said, Steve, you'll be my agenda, right? But I was just planning on giving an overview of our position politically and where tribes fit into all of this. It's quite fascinating how I would say as a political entity, we punch above our weight on a fairly regular basis. So in 1855, that's when the Treaty of Bay was negotiated. It's actually my 3-great-grandfather who served as the principal treaty negotiator. And at the time, I think back on the scenario surrounding treaty negotiations. I think there were the villages, because there are 5 villages. They were all decimated by disease, smallpox, you name it, whatever was brought over. If you didn't have the natural immunity to it that many groups had developed over thousands of years, it hit us pretty hard. There are stories that the old people used to tell of, they would line the beach with all of the deceased, because traditionally there was a way that we buried people, but that many people at once, we had no idea what to do with the actual bodies themselves. They're just lining the beach. It must have been a horrific time. And so in 1855, back when the population of Washington was around 3,000 people, I believe, the port was made a state of the territory. There were olive branches extended by the federal government to try to negotiate a treaty with various tribes in the region. And we had the, I guess, benefit of being one tribe, one treaty. So when the negotiators came out, are any of you familiar with treaties and how that all went down? So there's the Treaty of Olympia in Washington, and there are 4 tribes on that. Well,
Queets is part of it.
Okay. So 3 tribes on that, and Point Elliott,
That's 8.
8 on that. Makah, Treaty of Nia Bay, we're the only signatory, the Makah tribe. And really, Makah is kind of it's a translation. So the translator, because all this, we spoke Quidditch, which is or Quidditch. So that's our native language. It's a Wakashan language, part of a larger language family that extends up into the western half of Vancouver Island. So in the States, we're a language isolate. Our closest relatives, as Steve alluded to when he said we're the Southern Canadians, are up on Vancouver Island. So what we called ourselves was Quidditch, and that means people who live by the rocks and seagulls. If you go a little further north, there's the Achidat, CT. There are a lot of dots up there. How's us? Well, they're all up there. And we have lots of relationships up there. I myself am related to many families up on Vancouver Island. A lot of that stopped after, boy, what year did we stop up there? It was like, so I want to say it was 1883.
The commercial fishery started, how started in 1888.
Yeah.
And that was really the big transition.
So economic factors kind of, and economic interests of our respective countries prevented a lot of the border crossing and mingling that we had. And actually a provision of our treaty was that we wouldn't trade with a nation that wasn't the United States as well. That's something we fully agree with, but we were in dire straits at the time. And so the situation surrounding the treaty negotiations, as I mentioned, Makah is not what we called ourselves. That was what the Salish to our west, the Spalums called us. It means generous. And so the interpreter, because treaty negotiation took place in Chinook jargon, which is a trade language. And trade languages are very simplified in their grammar and their structure, really. So I think about how big of a task it is to negotiate a treaty that will affect your entire tribe and I guess government as a whole for time immemorial, who knows how long. In a tongue that's not your own, that's only really used for simple transactions. You know, it'd be trade, right? So pelts, fish, pretty simple things that you can put a quantitative value on. And so negotiating, you're basically your right to existence in that language. Now, a lot of details get missed in the finer points. So it's not perfect, but I think our negotiators at the time understood that it wasn't going to be perfect, but it was the best we were going to get. So the interpreter would talk to our negotiators in Chinook jargon and then translate that into English and what we have as a result of the Treaty of Nia Bay being 55. But because of the political factors at the time, Washington State was a territory, so it was under federal governance. Our treaty isn't with Washington State, it's with the federal government. And there's language in there that specifies that the only person who has authority over certain provisions of the negotiation or aspects of negotiation would be the President of the United States with the ultimate authority over the federal government at the time. And in 1855, the president was a lot more accessible, I believe, and the government has grown quite a bit, as well as the population of Washington State. I think I mentioned it was around 3,800 people at the time of the treaty signing, and now it's, I think, 7 million, or is it supposed to go higher? So that document made us into a political entity, which is interesting, because even if you go up further north to Alaska, they aren't political entities, they're all corporations. So that came as a result of ANCSA, the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act. And so they have corporations, they have shareholders, versus here tribal treaties are political entities. So we could make our own political system, of which I am a representative. So big thing for macaw and a big provision, there are two main provisions in, or well, I guess three. Whaling was basically our primary economic driver at the time because the bones, the oil, useful for preserving food, the bones to make artwork trinkets. Those were all big factors in our trading, and people wanted it. People came from Haida Gwaii, you could come down to trade with us, and you came up from California and everywhere really. It was a hot commodity at the time. The whaling is in our treaty. We're the only tribe in the United States that has whaling. Our right to whale listed in our treaty with the US government. So when we go whaling and we get a lot of the whaling quota because of the political factors as the country grew. Following World War II, the United States government entered and helped form the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, which I think, I forget how many, 95, I think, have signed on to that. So there are 95 countries involved in whaling. And the two that the US goes to the IWC for, there are two groups of people. It's macaws and the Alaskan Natives on the North Slope Borough. And we're the only two that are considered Aboriginal subsistence whalers, ASW. And so when we try to go whaling, we work with the US government, NOAA, and they go and they advocate for us on the IWC stage. And then our whaling quotas get assigned based on a vote from IWC. Crazy. And it's part of why I give some background on the population of the state at the time and the amount of people that were involved in that, because it's a great reminder for myself that everything we do and every piece of legislation we pass has ripple effects that are going to be felt for thousands of years. And I don't think that's something that we should take lightly at all. I don't, because it'll be maybe my 3 great grandkids, however many years from now. Even when I go back to the negotiation and the formation of our treaty, that's really only 5 people ago, which seeing what everything's become in 5 generations is kind of frightening, to tell you the truth. I think about that every time I sit in I-5 traffic. So I think about, our place in this point in time and the things we do that will have ripple effects 100 years from now, 200 years from now. So, and for us, fishing is a big one too. We were very proficient fishermen. So when the US and Canada signed the International Pacific Halibut Treaty. Yes, because I know it's the commission, I wasn't so sure what the actual treaty was. The US and Canada are the two who are signatories to that. And what wound up happening was the ocean halibut fishing grounds were divided up into areas. And we happened to be in area 2A. And actually this man here was a big part in helping establish our halibut fishing rights along with my uncle back in 70. First time that we had, I guess, a seat at the IPHG table and were recognized formally in that process due to our fishing rights, which the US at the time was, I guess, not honoring, more or less, which is a whole other story. But for treaty times, our anthropological evidence shows that we harvested around 2 or 3 million pounds of halibut a year, just out of canoes. I think that's a testament to not only our proficiency, but also the health of the species at the time. They were big halibut too. They weren't. I mean, halibut are still big today, but they're not anywhere near the pictures you'll see from the 30s or 40s when they were huge.
How far out to sea did you go?
So federally adjudicated, I think our UNA extends up to 50 miles offshore, or 40 miles offshore. But we have within our tribe evidence of whaling up to 300 miles offshore. And that would be a multi-day trip to tow a whale back to the shore. So it was the way of life, and there were if you were a whaler back in the day, that's all you did. All you did was whale. And you prepared for it every year, pretty rigorous training, spiritual training. We hunted grays and humpbacks, and grays are aggressive. So IPHC, we got recognized in that process. And just to put in perspective, when I said we harvested up to 2 million pounds a year by ourselves in canoes, the total allocation for Area 2A, which encompasses US, at least where we're at in the US, on the northwest corner, we're at in California, all the way down to Northern California, the total allocation this past year was 1.65 million pounds, and a tribal allocation of 468,000 pounds. So that's for Northern California, Oregon, all the way up to where we're at. And so I think about resources a lot too. The people go like this and the resources go like this. So managing that becomes very difficult. Because we're harvesting a small percentage of what we harvested back in pre-contact time. Then there's the big, I guess one of the bigger cases was USD Washington in 1974. Now, that's an interesting one because a lot of the older fishermen I talked to, macaw wasn't limited like a lot of people, like a lot of tribes were at the time. One of our most recent vice chairman, actually, he fished up in Alaska on his Indian card before bolt, he fished pre-bolt. But we weren't limited like a lot of tribes in Puget Sound or along the I-5 area were. And actually it was macaw, Yakima, and Lungi that had money and helped carry the decision for the good of all tribes too. So so I guess we gave up so that everybody else could have the right to fish or have the federally adjudicated right to fish. So that's something that's always on my mind as well. I do recognize, I go back and forth on the bolt decision all the time. Very possible that had that decision not come down, we wouldn't have the fisheries we have today, but it's something I always keep in my mind is the devil's advocate fisherman who's telling me, well, before you had federal adjudication on your catch, you had the whole thing. And now when you get it federally adjudicated, it's half. So bolt said half goes to the natives, half goes to the white guys. Half goes to the natives, half goes to the white guys. But if you look at it the other way, it's like, well, we lost half with the decision because you're never going to get that other half back. So that's also something I think about. And especially in my position now, there are no perfect solutions for anything. There are simply trade-offs. So what trade-offs are you doing with people? So that's how I examine that. Does anybody have any questions or anything you want to ask me?
Oh, we're just listening, fascinating.
Okay, okay, so a little bit about what makes macaw unique is our closest linguistic relatives are up north. So we're part of the Wakashan language family. And up on Vancouver Island, they whaled and sealed as well, and that's part of what made us so wealthy. But when we negotiated the treaty, that cut us off from a lot of that trade and that commerce we had, and took away maybe over 50% of our DNA, which we're hopefully working to get back into those grounds. But it's that's a slow process, so then we have to go through Canada's legal system as well. So offshore wind, we actually have some pretty major concerns about the impact of offshore wind on our fisheries. But because we have these federally adjudicated fishing rights, which I guess I can talk about UNA next.
Yes.
Yeah. So because we have federally adjudicated rights on our fisheries, which by laws, we have a certain amount that we are able to take every year. We have some pretty serious concerns about what the impacts to our fisheries would be with the implementation of an offshore wind energy project along the California current. Where we live on the northwest coast, and the most northwest point is unique in the sense that it's where different currents and ecosystems merge and creates a very productive halibut area, as well as ground fish, basically net fish. And so one of the big concerns that we have, and we had, is we've been to DC 3 or 4 times to talk about this with Bone and Interior, is what effect the wind farms would have on the upwelling, which helps cold water turn over and it cycles nutrients to the top for food for productive fish. So that's a big concern we have, and that's something that we routinely said, you can't put a monetary value on that, and what that was in terms of our right to exist, which we negotiated back in 1855, and ceded a fair amount of territory, land use territory, I think around 100,000 acres of UNA that we ceded that time. So we've been back talking about that, met with the director of BOEM at the time, Liz Klein, talked about our concerns, and I believe it helps slow the process down. And part of our other concern has to do with the logistics of the wind farms themselves, transmission lines, maintenance. We've talked with the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe on Martha's Vineyard about some of their issues they've been dealing with as a result of the wind farms that have gone up in their area. And they said, we've seen some impacts. They haven't been catching the fish in that area like they used to, and it's just cause for concern. I think about when the dams went up on Columbia River that destroyed a lot of the natural fisheries and the natural fish runs that we've had in the state since. And I think when you look at it from a 10-foot high perspective, it provided power, and as a result, Washington State has largely carbon-free electricity. But, it seemed like it's kind of greenwashing, in my opinion, because you're just taking from one other pool of natural resources and you're front-loading those impacts on another environmental aspect. So, and now we're almost entirely dependent on hatchery fish and the hatcheries on the Columbia River, of which we catch about 47% of our salmon treaty troll allocation spawn up the Columbia River. So it's had an effect on us too. So when I look at the dams and I look at how that affected the environment that way, I'm thinking about the wind farms and saying, well, if they don't know, then who's to say what the impacts will be on further on this resource that's already been stripped, basically, and left us relying on hatchery fish, which I have concerns about hatchery fish in that they're less genetically diverse, more prone to, and when things are less genetically diverse, they're more prone to genetic diseases, which make them less healthy as a whole. So now I'm not anti-hatchery fish because it's what we have, but I just worry about straining the resource more that way. UNAs. So because our treaties are negotiated with the federal government, anytime we go for a UNA adjudication, it's the federal government that decides what our usual and accustomed is what UNA stand for. So our UNA was adjudicated as a result of the Bolt decision, right? As a proceeding of USD Wash, right?
Yeah, for the, north and south, and then the western.
Yeah. And so what that means is we fish under tribal regs, tribal regulations. We cover our regulations under the advice of our fisheries and biologists' recommendations, and they examine what the health of our stocks are within our UNA. And they have regulations based on, well, it's more complicated than that because there's lots of other bodies that mean lots of other biologists and tribes. We have to work together to determine these things. And as a result of all these intertribal processes and data sharing, we assign quotas to our fishermen based on what our tribal departments and then, Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission do, they help compile all the data and then we sort out any of our differences there. And it's such now that there are tribes that are seeing such low returns to their rivers where if they really wanted to, they could shut everybody down in the ocean because we're talking about they're getting, based on the modeling, 2-3 fish back, which is outrageous in my opinion. And I'm happy that they don't, but it's something that weighs on me as well, is there are tribes out there that are in a much less fortunate position than we are in terms of our natural resources. So our fisheries department, with which Mr. Donor here was well, I guess is still an employee, but was, I'll read there, Steve.
Before you were born.
So over
Started in 77.
over 31 years, yeah, so 48 years. So Steve's very familiar with all the processes I just laid out, and I think things are more civil now than they've been in a very long time, but when you're fighting over fish, it's tough because everyone says, it's fish, we used to just go fish. So, and that's, something that I also think about in relation to government on how it affects people's everyday lives is, it's fish. Why don't we just go fishing? But because of how populations are mapped out and, returns, people map returns on their rivers and they use fish tagging. You can then use those mathematical algorithms to determine how many fish get returned to the river based on the recovery of 3 or 4 tags. And it's all very interesting to say the least. But it's a complex process. And we have, in my opinion, one of the best fisheries departments in the country. I would say we punch above our weight regularly. And we allocate a lot of tribal resources to mitigating environmental factors and taking care of our fish stocks as well. And we're pretty strict about our dates, our regulations. And all of those regulations they have to comply with the determination by the federal government on our UNAs. And so we cut tribal regulations specifically for our UNAs. And we do have some, we call them cowboy fishermen that fish out of Nia Bay too, and they fish under state regs, which are different than tribal regs. So we write our own laws, we manage our own fisheries, and that's the position that we try in when it comes to managing our natural resources.
Why don't you mention the tribe's dependence on fishing as far as the community income?
So community income, I believe we have the largest treaty fleet in the country. I don't think Metro Capital is bigger enough anymore, no. So our community is very dependent on fishing, right? It's the thing that keeps the village going. If we didn't have fishing, we'd be in a tough spot. And so our economy and our prosperity ebbs and flows with the success of our fishing fleet. A big obstacle we have is we don't have the capacity currently. We're looking at in the future to provide a value added service for our fishermen. That would be cold storage is the big one. So we sell, you can always sell a more refined product for more money than raw one, right? So right now we're selling, raw whole fish basically, and the amount that we see relative to what we could receive if we had some other processing capability would be, it's much less. So I think our last nutritional survey, 85% of our households subsidize their nutrition with fish with KMC or CNS, ceremonial and subsistence catch. And the economic benefits, even when whiting was at its peak, I think it was about a $7 million benefit to the community from our whiting boats. Which is $7 million in our community is a lot relative to our size. Since the whiting fishery has been in a tough place, the communities take a little bit of a hit from just our actual cash flow within the village as well.
Well, I'll mention, and then you can pick up, is that, Rufus mentioned the Treaty of Olympia, which are the Quileute-Po tribes and Quinnell Indian Nation. The four coastal tribes collectively share the tribal allocation or set aside of all the various species that are managed by the Pacific Fishery Management Council or through the Pacific Fishery Management Council. And we have developed sharing arrangements, management plans, but it's a challenge to take the fish that are available and to spread it out through the tribes and meet each tribe's needs. And of course, each tribe has relatively more or less dependence on a given species. Macaw with whiting, Quileute and Quinnell much more on crab. But black cod, and of course salmon is the primary fishery for the three tribes to the south of us. But the concern that Rufus mentioned, the concern we expressed to Boehm at the start of this 3 or 4 years ago was, first of all, what's this going to do to the upwelling? And then I mentioned to him that we have a black cod or sablefish nursery area right on the mountain straight along Utica. And were they aware of those? And of course, they had no clue what we were talking about. So we realized that this planning was going ahead just kind of blindly to develop the ocean energy with very little or no regard for the salmon species, and no consideration or even an understanding that the wind farms could impact species hundreds of miles away and fisheries that depend on those. So that's where we realize that they're going about this totally wrong. It's like, we'll put the wind farms here because that's where the wind is. Now, what is going to be impacted? How do we mitigate it? So I think,
I look at it much like an energy function in physics or a force diagram where you're messing with aspects of the diagram on the left side and you see the results on the right. And one thing that we told Boehm and the feds when we went back east was if you start messing with force functions on the left side here, you're not going to get the same outputs. And their goal was 30 by 30, so they wanted 30 gigawatts by 2030, which if you take 30 gigawatts out of the ocean, that's nobody knows what that's gonna look like. And that's, I don't know what that would look like. It's hard to fund a study that can encapsulate all of the questions that we have about what it's gonna do to our fish area and our ocean ecosystem. And a big, I guess, opposition that we have is if you open the ocean for development, it's like a hook, right? If you get a hook in there, then what's one more thing, what's one more thing, what's one more thing? And after a while, you'll be looking at the ocean and it's gonna be totally developed and changed, and there's very little we understand about the ocean and how the ocean actually functions. I was watching a video recently by an oceanographer who was talking about, there's dark matter in physics, where they can't account for 80% of the matter in the universe, so they just like allocate this thing that they call dark matter because it has to be out there. There's a dark fish in the ocean too, that based on some of the population estimates, and I don't remember exactly what it is, but they're like, well, there's gotta be way more fish out there than we can even imagine right now. Because our capabilities to get to the bottom of the ocean and to really survey the ecosystem of the ocean as a whole are very limited, much more limited than even getting space out. So, if you start messing with that aspect of our planet, I was just concerned about how the process was moving ahead and what was gonna happen as a result. I think 80% of the fish is unaccounted for in the ocean. We only see a small percentage because the pressure and the depth is just too much to actually survey the true, biological breadth of how the ocean, I guess, flows and operates our world within it. So, I think development of the ocean was it's a red line for us and something we don't want to see happen. I myself, I am a strong proponent for nuclear energy. I attended in the ECA forum in Richmond, excuse me, the Tri-Cities, where the first atomic bomb, where the uranium was enriched there. And I'm all in on nuclear power myself. There's a great app I was talking to Mr. Joner about here. It's called Energy Maps. It maps out all the electrical grids in the world and all the countries that report their fuels and their emissions and such. I think climate change is absolutely happening in some way, shape, or form. I'm not totally sure on the cause, but I do know that China burns about 500 kilotons of coal a year, and that's, I think, 20 times more in terms of carbon emissions than any other country. I think the next closest country would be us, and we're only a fraction of what they put out. The country of France is 87% on a nuclear grid, or on a nuclear, they're all on nuclear reactors. They get 80% from a reactor, and then they get an additional 7% from re-enriched uranium. They basically take, when you use a D-cell battery or a battery and you lose the juice, right, and it doesn't work. They developed a process back in the 1980s, I think, when there was a uranium shortage or scarcity, to get as much juice out of their remaining uranium as they possibly could have. It's a very expensive process that takes a lot of time, and they get 7% from recycled fuel. And actually, when I was at the ECA forum and I was asking some questions to various physicists and people who operate nuke plants about this subject, they said that it was great for the time, but now the cost of developing the means to extract all the remaining uranium are not cost efficient anymore, because there's not a surplus of uranium, but there's enough to go around at the moment. So it's cheaper to just buy the uranium product than to develop the process to use the spent fuel. But France, 87%. It's a developed country. I think the US could use some more, and probably knock our emissions down by 30 or 40% before we even get there. But there are lots of supply chain issues that are costs are rising everywhere. And a big theme that they had at the conference was, we need someone to just take the hit and pull us all over the fence, because that's largely how these developments are. These hurdles are cleared is when somebody takes the hit, pull the rest of us. And I see benefit from that on many levels. The Columbia River has 17 dams on it currently. 4 of the 5 largest hydroelectric dams in the country are on the Columbia. The Chief Joseph Grand Coulee, the John Day. And give me, I don't remember the other one.
The Dalles.
Yeah, right. And so 4 of the 5 are on the Columbia and, you know, that's a real obstacle to fish recovery in my opinion too. It's hard to have natural spawners, when you have a 100-foot cement structure, blocking the river. And it's not, it's necessary at this point, I think, because our state has grown to such a level where we're using more and more electricity, but I just think about the benefits of offloading that load on the grid to another source would benefit a lot of people. And, stuff too, because like, as I said earlier, there are no silver bullet solutions to anything. There are just trade-offs. And, another one that I think is tough when you're interfacing at that level is the, irrigation component. I know Washington's got some really productive farmland on the east side of the state, and a lot of that's water from the Columbia that irrigates their crops, and the dams are for that as well. But yeah, that's when we toured there is actually a nuclear plant that operates in Richland currently. It's the Energy Northwest plant. They produce about 1.6 gigawatts of electricity a year. Which is quite a lot of electricity. But the waste is all currently stored in a big cement container. And actually I have a picture of my phone here. The area that the waste for the past 45 years is stored in is probably about the size of this building. So I know there are lots of concerns about the waste, but that's a trade-off I'm willing to take if it means restored water table and a more, I guess, actually environmentally friendly energy source. There's another, I think about, in the US, it's estimated that about 1 million people a year die as a result of inhalation from coal plants. And there are areas in Iowa and some other Midwestern states where if you go out to your car in the morning, there's a thin layer of coal dust coating your car. And those are people's jobs and everything too, and I'm conscious of that. But there's a town in Wyoming, Kemmerer, they were a coal town. And actually Bill Gates is funding their switch from a coal plant to a nuclear reactor. And one of the gals who was at the ECA forum is I think she's one of the directors at INL, Idaho National Labs. The Bureau of Labor in the US assigned the job code to every laborer in the country. And a laborer who works in a coal plant and an operator at a nuke plant, there are only 2 character difference in their occupation. So I mean, their responsibilities are really similar and their duties are similar because it's essentially the same mechanism of generating electricity from coal in that you're combusting something and harnessing the reaction to use energy that can be transmitted up through the line and sent places. Yeah, and I think about it all the time when I drive on I-5 and I just see the development and roads and cities and buildings and all the people using electricity on top of this state and the I-5 corridor in particular being a hotbed for tech development, quantum computing, another thing that requires a huge amount of energy. Same thing with artificial intelligence. There's got to be something to power that, and it's concerning to me if you're going to pull all that out of Columbia, because Columbia's it's a big ecosystem, and we messed with that a lot. So, boy, that took me
Yeah,
funny direction.
so if I could just bring it back, suggest, what does it mean to you when you read that your pre-grade said, the sea is my country?
Well, to me, that's the ethos of who we are as a people. Because what Sakawa did was he said, look, before we even talk, you're gonna get in the canoe with me and we're gonna go out in the ocean and we're gonna go for a ride. So he took Isaac Stevens out into his canoe, and he pointed at the land and said, basically, that, I don't care. He grabbed the water and said, this is my country. This is how I make my living. This is how I fed my family. This is how I provided for my community. And this is how I want my great grandchildren to provide for their community as well. So it's the ethos of who we are, and it's tough if you see development on the ocean and developing that resource to, you know, charge our smartphones. I realize that society, it's going one way, and we're, you know, if you look at a line function, we're way up here in terms of our energy consumption, but I think there are better ways that we can meet those demands. Messing with an ecosystem that we still have limited understanding of. Myself.
Thank you.
Thank
Steve,
I do have a question.
yeah, I was gonna see if, committee members had questions, so go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, just, you mentioned the 1855 treaty was with the federal government and the president, but a lot of your work now is with the state. And how does that work? You know, decision making with the state, and what's your level of satisfaction with that, or sense that
So
you're being heard?
yeah, so we it's an interesting relationship, and we're getting along a lot better with the state than we used to, for sure. But we actually, and I guess I've underplayed how much we dealt with the federal government. Because of whaling, we interface with NOAA on a fairly regular basis. We talked with Jen Kwan a lot, who's our regional administrator. And actually, just a month and a half ago, the chairman and myself got to meet with the acting administrator, Enyo, in DC. So we interface with the feds quite a bit, and forestry is a whole other topic, but we also interface with PIA through there. We talked with Doug Burgum at the STAC meeting. Actually, our chairman is on the Secretary's Tribal Advisory Committee, which is the Secretary of the Interior, and at the last STAC meeting, he noted that Doug Burgum stayed for the entire STAC meeting versus previously when it was Deb Holland, she was there for, 30, 40 minutes. So it feels like they're hearing us, for sure. And, and whether that translates into policy that we're ultimately happy with, that's yet to be seen, but part of it is just feeling like they're being heard. So in dealing with the state, the way that the USD Washington case was, the opinion was authored by Judge Bolt, it's that we co-manage with the state. And so we interface with the state because basically the federal government said, okay, go figure it out, you guys can work it out. And as a result, we formed the Northwest Indian Fish Commission, which took all the treaty tribes in Washington state, and we're in a group and we talk about fish, and then we take those recommendations and what we agree on there, and we bring that to the Pacific Fishery Management Council, who then ultimately authors the decision on what our fisheries will be for this season. So this year it was in San Jose. What was that? I think it's Vancouver. Yeah, that's right. So that's how that interfacing happens. We sort it out with tribes, and then among ourselves, we ultimately agree on our options for the season tribally, and then we go bring that to the Pacific Fishery Management Council, and they render the ultimate decision. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Ryan?
Thanks so much for being here, and thanks for talking so much about stuff, a whole range of stuff, so, great. I wanted to, maybe explore a little bit from your perspective. There's a lot changing on the federal side too, with regard to reviewing the permitting process and the way the feds operate under the National Environmental Policy Act and a bunch of stuff. So like everything's changing all at the same time, but we've heard pretty consistently that tribes are challenged by not only the burden of consultation over a project, but the fact that you get multiple, sequential sets of, consultation. And I wonder if you, have any thoughts for us about how that process works, and particularly with regard to, how it has gone in, with regard to, I mean, recognizing these are not Washington state projects that are wind energy areas currently. But in terms of how it has gone and what you think the position would be in consultation, it's a little speculative, but if you were consulted today about a wind energy area,
Yeah,
what
so,
would your position be?
so a lot of our difficulty was getting the federal government to understand that just because we have UNAs, right? And we have adjudication by the federal government, but the resources that we harvest are migratory. And that they're tied to the current and not our area. So that was our biggest concern with the wind farms in California, was how is it going to affect, which will affect our resources as a whole. And one of the challenges that we would harp on the federal government is we need a fix to the Outer Continental Shelf Act, which doesn't recognize tribal authority in the way the act. That and the CBMA, the Coastal Zone Management Act, are two which the Biden administration was using its authority on those two acts to spur some of this development and zoning. So we're advocating for tribal involvement in those two acts. And a lot of it too is, if we can get in front of people and talk about this and they can bring it back, that's how a lot of that interfacing happens. And luckily, we were able to meet with some pretty high level people. By the administration as well as the, I guess BOEM is under the fire administration. So, and all these different wings of the federal government, we've been able to get in front of some people and talk about our concerns and our frustration for the process as well. So whether that translates to fix, it's tough to get anything passed in Congress and the Senate, right? But that's, Also, we talked with Senator Cantwell and, Patty Murray on these issues a lot too, and, they're pretty decent advocates for the tribes. Cantwell in particular talked about her concerns regarding offshore wind and, development.
I want to jump in and say that, Bruce's dad, Greg Arnold, famously told the federal agency when they came to us with plans that were already ongoing, being developed, and it was maybe step 3 in the process. He said, no, you have to start over. You come to us at step 0.
Yeah.
We're the first stop. And there are not many federal agencies that get that. NOAA Fisheries does.
Yeah.
And I've worked many years with a lot of federal agencies, and I could say they're the one and only agency, and the Coast Guard as well. We have a great relationship with the Coast Guard. Gets that the tribe is an equal and is the partner. And so that's been really the failure in this process. Again, it was way too far down the road before they said, oh yeah, let's talk to the tribes.
Yeah. By the time we got involved, it felt like it was already at step 3, or I'd say step 3. And by going back and getting in front of these people and advocating for our position, probably took it back to step 1 or so, which, depending on how you look at it. But NOAA is very good. We talk with NOAA intimately when we're starting planning for the IWC process. We're already in contact with staff from NOAA about the next quota allocation. Forgive me the dates. I got a lot kicking around up here, I think. But the next IWC quota allocation, we're already in communication with Ryan Wolf and folks that know a lot about those processes and where we need to be and what we need to wrench on and prepare for those meetings. Yeah.
You think we have time for 1 or 2 more questions? Jeremy and then Dave, I wanted to check with you about Patrick that for a while.
Yeah, hi, hey Rufus, everybody, thanks for being here. And I wholeheartedly agree with you that I always found it very peculiar that the CDMA doesn't have provisions like the ARI, that tribes can be treated like states and have their own focus on that. I agree. One thing that I know that we're gonna be interested in is, tribal capacity, to engage. So you know, it's one thing to talk about step 0 and step 1, step 2 and step 3. And, you know, can you speak to the, you know, I guess both sort of the monitoring and human capacity of the tribe to respond to a series of different developments, and obviously there's a lot of complexity and some individual differences between every single development.
Yeah, boy, there are 5 of us on the tribal council, and then we have Steve for offshore wind and our attorneys, and so that's 10 people plus our natural resource policy analyst. That's 11 people who shouldered a lot of this work. Our attorneys read a lot of the environmental impact statements, so those are several, well, actually, that's actually one of my bigger complaints about the process too. So, in order for our whaling quota, NOAA had to put out what's called, an EIS, environmental impact statement, for the effect of one whale on the PCFG, the Pacific Coast Feeder Group population. That EIS for one whale was 3,783 pages. And one of my biggest things when we went back to DC was I said, you guys basically want to put hardware in the ocean that's going to be billions and billions of dollars for less paper than's been put out for our one whale. Like that's not adding up. It's one whale versus potentially changing an entire ecosystem. The capacity, so in terms of our capacity, mostly, like I said, 13 of us shoulder a lot of that too, and we're charged with a lot of these, juggling a lot of these topics and making sure we're getting in front of the right people. It's, yeah, I guess that's part of the work, is figuring out how to navigate through the process in order to talk to the people who can make these decisions. If you don't know who they are, well, it's tough.
And what about sort of internal technical, so not just sort of the lawyers and the you yourself, but you know, obviously there's a lot, there's obviously the upwelling, there's shots, there's climate change, and then understanding the technology, the mooring lines, the cabling, the foundations, all of it. Can you talk to us about sort of the technical capacity?
Yeah, so the technical capacity, so we relied on Tommy Moore a lot. He's an oceanographer who has a lot of the ocean ecosystem mapped out. He works for the Norwell. Is he still there? Or was his last day? I'm going to his farewell tomorrow.
Yeah, I think the 27th maybe.
So, he works for the tribes, he works for the Northwest Fish Commission. But mainly it's been, you know, the council body, Steve here, and our fisheries department that was shouldering a lot of that technical work and technical review. And then our attorneys shoulder all of the legal review of language in some of these agreements itself, which was part of frustration of mine, was there actually wasn't a ton of paperwork to review in like lease agreements or anything. It was less substantial than our one whale, which wasn't really adding up to me either. So, yeah, it's very limited capacity. It's, you know, we're trying to do the best we can to keep up and pretty well, or are doing pretty well.
Why don't you mention the request to know fisheries and then they all paid out last year? the research.
Yeah, so last June, Jen Kwan and her administrative team, we hosted 23, sorry, excuse me. We hosted 23 employees from NOAA and we requested that they do a more technical study and figure out how to get it done on how the upwelling and changes to the upwelling would affect, you know, this ecosystem, and that went pretty well. Felt like they were hearing us. I don't know how many of them are still there. I know Jen's still there. So we put in an official request to have some more of these studies done so we could sleep better.
Is that a model, you think, of, how to approach some of the capacity building capability?
Could potentially, you know, I want to see some data on something, and I just struggle with how, you know, and I guess that's their job to figure out too, but how do you, I guess, write a study or come up with a study that really encapsulates the breadth of the ocean, which is what I spoke to earlier about, you know, dark fish, the 80% of fish or so that are estimated to be there that we have no accounting for. Yeah, it's a tough job, and I know it's a tough job, but it's my job to look after my community and look after our rights and our treaty adjudicated fishing.
So I've been wavering whether I should ask this question or not, but it actually been asked, but it seems to me it ultimately comes down to trust. You know, who do you folks trust, the Macaw tribe in this case, to inform you whether or not to make a decision? Yes, ocean renewable energy is good or it's not good, and I guess you tell me I'm wrong, that it's not trust that's important, but if it isn't, if it is important, and I think you actually answered it, at least in part, the answer, and I really appreciate what you said today. How do we get there? What do we articulate in the report that allows that trust to exist in order to have the decisions made, if you see what I mean?
Yeah, boy, that's a tough one, because you know, and I understand what you're saying, but for me, it's just really hard to think about developing the ocean and
Let me say, sorry to interrupt, but what comes to my mind is our small island nations in the UN climate change talks that are being affected by sea level rise. They're numerically small entities compared to the US and China and other places, but they have a large say because they're being affected by sea level rise. And so the question is, how do you perceive your role in that sort of a scenario, if you will? I mean, you're a sovereign nation.
yeah.
And the odds are reasonably good that there's gonna be a decision somewhere 20 years from now that is gonna promote or, try and promote offshore energy development, it seems to me. How do you deal with it? I'm sure you asked this question all the time.
Well, and I guess when I think about climate change and everything surrounding that, I'm, I guess, a little more of a skeptic than a lot of people. I'm not saying it's not changing, but I'm not sure that, sometimes I think there are processes in the world, and personally now, this is the tribal position. There are processes in the world that we're not totally in tune with because of how short our lifespan truly is. It wasn't that long ago that the Sahara was green either. So I think there are some things that, for lack of a better term, just change too. So I'm not saying that, our carbon output and our use of coal isn't contributing. I think the human health impacts of that can't be overstated enough. But Yeah, that's a tough one, yeah, but at the same time, I'm advocating for my community and the concerns that my fishermen have with, you know, bringing home money to put food on the table for their families. My job, that's what I got elected to do, with the people elected me to my position. Yeah.
Thank you so much for taking the time and making a trip out there and taking the time with us.
Thank you. Miss anything, Steve, anything big?
I don't think so, other than, I was just gonna wrap up, and Danny, on the Constitution here. And as Joe probably know, Article 6 says treaty laws made under this, Constitution and treaties which are made or shall be made by the United States are the supreme law of the land. So really that tells it all to me. That is the obligation of the United States, you know. They have treaties that must come before any, economic need. You know, we understand that there are, you know, it's very complicated, but, the process that went on the last few years with offshore wind has been a failure as far as dealing with the tribes and the US obligation. So, that's where I think the trust has to be developed, is that, the US has to put the resources there to address its obligations to the tribes. And, really to, not just as a legal obligation, but just as a respect to the tribes and then to move forward with what can be done from there. Okay?
Yeah, that's great, yeah.
And again, as a committee, we just want to thank you for being here and also your heartfelt thought. You really did a good job of communicating.
Thank you.
Your position. So thank you. Okay, we're ready for lunch.
Happy to talk more about nuke powder if anyone wants to.
Is there?
Good afternoon and welcome to our session. We are moving into our part of the agenda to hear about the Washington State Marine planning effort. And we have with us today Corey Niles with the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife. And I've known Corey going on 18 years now. And he is one of the state delegates to the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And joining us online is Casey Dennehy with the Washington Department of Ecology. And they are going to be talking to us today about the state marine spatial plan. So welcome, Corey and Casey.
Thank you, Michelle. And I see, yeah, Casey's online there, great. I can just say next slide, thing, okay. So, yeah, Michelle, thanks for covering it. If you're on the second slide, just a little information about Casey and myself. Man, why is the guy from fishing WDFW giving a talk on marine spatial planning? I think you'll maybe see why we focus here on fishing, and our state law gives WDFW a role there. But Casey is with our Department of Ecology, and they're the lead agency for us on marine spatial planning, coastal zone management, and all that. And he's our lead on the marine spatial plan. But as you'll see, the state's taken an interagency approach to the marine spatial planning in our state. So yeah, next slide, please. And just to manage expectations, there's no way I can cover every angle of what we've done. So the Casey and colleagues have built some really nice websites in recent years, and so I just want to make sure the presentation has those links, including to the full marine spatial plan, the full document. And we have some data online. There's a transition going on from our old data portal to this, incorporating that information into the ecology's coastal atlas. And It's a work in progress as I understand it, but you can see some of the data we're talking about, up there. The next slide, please. You know, and think about this presentation, to me, it breaks down into two eras, so to speak. As Michelle said, I started with WFW in 2007, so I've been involved in some form or fashion with this that whole time. You know, wasn't soon after joining WFW that I started joining Michelle's team, and she was the one that really led us through this first that first era, and including with Casey's predecessor Jennifer Hennessy, where much of the force behind what we're talking about in this first era. And then the second era here starts, you know, in the Biden administration and in the fall of 2021, and with events ongoing. So kind of how I'm breaking it up. And next slide, please. So I'm one of the people that puts too many words on slides, but they're mostly meant to cue me to say certain things. But looking at the website and this committee's, the objective of your study, and I thought there's you know, multiple parts to this, but the two things I thought Washington's experience might help with was that one, which is documenting historic and current uses, and we can show you how we did that. But I think number three though, I think that's when we've done a lot of thinking and still have a lot of questions and not answers yet on how the decision-making process for offshore wind has worked. And as we heard from Steve and Rufus, there's, you know, plenty of questions about the BOEM process. And now I'll try to throw in a few things about my background, just to give more context. But as Michelle mentioned, one of my main role is with our agency at the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. I wear a few hats there, and we sit on the Marine Planning Committee with Steve and with Mike Conroy, another committee member. So we've while this is Washington Pacific, we have, you know, through the council and other arenas have paid a lot of attention to what's going on in California and Oregon, and at the council, at the Pacific Fisheries Management Council. Next slide, please. So just kind of what I'm gonna try to steer your attention to is, it's funny, when we spent a lot of time on that first era developing a plan, and then when offshore wind came back, I really wanted to put a picture of Rodney Dangerfield into my presentation, because I felt like Washington's experience was kind of ignored. And just because BOEM was growing in California, it was almost that no one thought Washington had thought at all about this. And, you know, we get reactions like, well, your plan just applies to state waters, right? And we're like, I know the whole intent was to influence, you know, federal waters, and it wasn't about offshore wind, was it? And it's like, well, it was about many things, but offshore wind was a big focus. So chip on my shoulder, so to speak, but we did a lot of thinking went in and by the state. And again, I was a small part of the team back then, but people, you know, when it came to the second era, I really realized there's a lot of thoughtfulness that went into it. And next slide, please. And these are some questions we got from you all ahead of time. You know, the first one, how are the competing interests weighted or not? And I think I'll get to that. I'll answer that one as we go through the slides. And how do we include the tribes in spatial planning? You heard some from Steve and Rufus earlier, and it's you'll see that the tribes are very much were in the focus and in the mind of our legislature when they gave us this mandate to do this. But as Steve and Rufus were saying, you know, the tribes have their own their sovereign nation. They have government to government relationships with each other, with us, with the state and the federal government. And so there's, I think the desire was, you know, for this, to partner on this plan, that, you know, recognize that, you know, the tribes are their own actors in this world. And we saw that when the second era came around, that we saw that, you know, you know, come to bear. As Steve said, you know, they wanted to be involved at step 0, and we're each tribe separately, you know, approaching Bone and their federal trustees differently. So kind of a, hopefully they'll give you a better answer as we go through this, but the tribes did contribute, but they also, you know, have their own research, somewhat like the Quinaults have their own plan. Steve, I forgot what you else, I thought, Katie was working on one for you all, but my memory was gone. So they're kind of separate, but also partnering, towards common goals. Next slide, please. And as I noted, this is our, for those who don't know, our state laws were, the revised code of Washington are our statutes. And this is where, we started doing this because the legislature told us to. And you can see there that it was the workers of this, creators of this plan, we're an interagency team. You know, Department of Ecology was the lead. Us and then Department of Natural Resources were the main agencies involved, but there are others that we cooperate with through the State Ocean Caucus, we call it. And so they gave us this mandate, they said, don't do anything until you get funding for it. And so they gave it to us in 2010, and then funding came in 2012, and just kind of a fact I always thought was kind of funny is the you can see that's the gooey duck revenues there on the right in the figure. And if you see, you look at 2011 and 2012, there was a big sort of jump in the value of those, and like the stock assessment for those, but our DNR, Department of Natural Resources, auctioned the rights off for those gooey ducks in Puget Sound, and that could be quite valuable. So that's where the legislature saw the money, opportunity to take money and redirect it toward this. And in Washington, the coast always feels second to Puget Sound. So it was kind of nice that it took resources from Puget Sound to get some attention to the coast for once. Next slide, please. And just quickly, I'm sure you all seen this, but just, you know, but back then there was interest, you know, more increasing talk about offshore wind, and Washington wind resource, you know, is you know, comparable to Central California, not as great as off of Northern California and Central Oregon, but you know, we have heard other things that we have better wind in the winter than Oregon does, kind of. So it just the resource, the potential was there. That's, you know, that kind of thing got our legislature going. The next slide, please. And so this is the legislative findings section of that statute I've been referencing. You know, in terms of the tribes, you can see, you know, subsection A, you know, front and center is recognition of the importance of the ocean and marine resources to our Native American tribes. And then there's like, I forget how many subsections, but these are just the first two, but that last sentence or so in subsection B really kind of gets the gist of what we were being asked to do, I think, and, you know, consider what new uses of the ocean might do to our existing uses. And the goal is to come up with a proactive, comprehensive, ecosystem-based way of decision making. That was the aspiration, at least. Next slide. And before I get, you know, among the cast of characters involved, we have the Washington Coastal Marine Advisory Council, which is the Governor's Advisory Council. Some people call it WCMAC, some people call it WACMAC. It's been around for a while. There's been no convergence on the name. At least one of the offshore wind developers calls it WitchMac. So many different names for it, but this is one of our main advisory bodies. You know, for stakeholders. The tribes are not formally part of it because, you know, they're governments, not stakeholders, but they have participated in during developing the plan. I remember the Quileute in particular had someone there at every meeting giving feedback at that point. All right, next slide, please. And just here's a look at the plan. I think I forgot to say it was I think this was a picture of the draft. And it was in 2017, came out, and then it was finalized in 2018. Coincidentally, I think it was finalized like the same day that the first Trump administration issued a new oceans policy. The only reason why I remember that. And you can see some of the goals and objectives there on that. How do we weight uses? You see that, you know, they're not equally weighted, but existing uses do have some standing, and you'll see fishing in particular. Our laws give, you know, weight those a bit higher, or more than a bit probably. Just next slide. This is an outline of the chapters. I'm mainly going to focus on chapter 4, which is the management framework. You know, chapter 2 describes like our fisheries in narrative form. And I believe, you know, the tribes contributed to that in describing their own fisheries. If you want to learn more, it's probably one of the only places you'll see the state's fisheries discussed in one place, one of the few places. In 3, we did some spatial analyses, and then again, the WIC map was a big advisor in this, and that chapter captures the recommendations from them. Next slide. So I'm gonna kind of fly through some of these, that you can see some of them just more where a lot of the, you know, the objectives came from the legislature. And there you can see on the left, it tells us to look at the EEZ. It's not just state waters. Yeah, I think I'll some of these points will be done. Next slide, please. And this section here is kind of what the plan should include. And people kind of forget that it also told us, rather than just planning, it said, you know, do an ecosystem assessment, and you know, which we looked at ecosystem indicators, and it was great to have Jamil and Owen here, because we really relied heavily on NOAA's integrated ecosystem assessment team, and you know, couldn't have done this without the federal help. And I'm sure that'll be a theme in your what you're hearing from everybody about what this current state of the federal government and NOAA's budget in particular will do to our ability to fulfill these goals. And so again, up on the upper right, you can see again, the legislature is telling us we must recognize and value existing uses. That paragraph 12 there, and this is a key point to understand, you know, what the potential effect of this plan was, is they told us to incorporate the plan into the coastal zone management program, and we now have new enforceable policies because of that. Next slide. This is just saying, like, the plan only applies to new things, not things that were already permitted or being considered during the development of the plan. And here, just I don't have time here to kind of illustrate what we did. We spent good amount of time mapping the fisheries data we have. And the next slide here shows you, you know, when we brought all, and these are just the state and federal, not the non-tribal fisheries, but when you put them all together with the data we have, this is what it looks like. Just doing pretty simple methods of just kind of, we had a hexagon grid, that's our study area. It goes out to 700 fathoms, but for similar reasons that Owen mentioned, they were looking at. And you can see a lot of activity kind of, you know, straddling with the shelf break, and a lot coming from our crab fishery, which we'll see in a second happens from Westport, Grays Harbor on down mainly. And the data cutoff for this, you know, we finished in 2018, but we cut the data off in 2014. So these are still, you know, all going over 10 years old. Next slide, please. Indigenous crab. This is one of our data richer maps. And so I'm like, well, I don't know if you've heard yet, but you know, there's a lot of efforts from the, you know, from their interest in offshore wind on doing better maps of our fisheries. And this is one where you'll be able to do better. You now have electronic monitoring that gets the location of every crab pot that's pulled. I don't think the picture here will the darker areas are more important than the lighter areas. I don't think you'll see that, change, but you'll get finer resolution data. And just a couple other, you can see that hashed area, that's the Quinel's special management area, which is gonna, affect how your map looks when you're just mapping the non-tribal data. And so, we would always say, hey, if you want to understand what's gonna happen to the tribal fisheries, you have to talk to them, but if it's in their UNA, they're gonna care and think it's important. So, that's another way we dealt with, we didn't use the tribal data directly, but it's pretty, you don't need to do fancy mapping to say that UNA is really important to the particular tribe. And then in contrast, the next slide is our commercial salmon troll. And I don't know how we do any better than this because there is no data for this fishery. They don't have logbooks, they don't have observers. Only a fraction have vessel monitoring. So the way we did this was, like we do a lot of things, we have advisory groups of people we respect and have a lot of experience on the water. And this is, high, medium, low version of where the salmon trollers fish. And just next slide, it'll kind of be hard to see. This is from a paper that Jamil was on 2018, but you can see on this right panel, they tried to use vessel monitoring system, VMS data, to try to map in the important troll grounds, salmon grounds. And if you look at Northern Washington, which was highly important in the other map, not even showing up at all here. So it's just a limitation. There are some fisheries where you're gonna get better data for, but at least on the West Coast, we're not gonna have that in any foreseeable future. And Mike Conroy on here will probably explain the tuna map has similar issues on only certain boats use VMS and might not be capturing our local fleets that tend to say, don't go as far offshore. The shrimp map, on the other hand, looks almost exactly like our logbooks, which was interesting. All right, so trying to go faster here. This is just going quick overview of what we did for our use spatial analysis. And the next slide just kind of sums it all up. We threw everything. We didn't have just fishing maps. We had like shipping and ecologically important areas, which were based on a number of species distribution models. Again, a lot of benefit from having work that NOAA did, both NIMF and the NCOS group, which I can never remember what that stands for, on seabirds and marine mammals. And then just we took this idea from conservation planning and Mark Sand analysis, which is an optimization tool. And if you can kind of make out, there's a couple of hexagons of purple and blue we're showing where it gave you, an energy goal for producing, I forget what it was, how many units of electricity kind of thing, and find it for the least overlap with the existing uses. And that's where it came up. But we quickly realized that, these methods are only good as the data that goes in. Everything was equally weighted, and so that and by the time we had finished the plan, you started to see like these huge, the turbine would get larger, and then the amount of power you can get per unit space totally changed. So I think before even finishing the plan, we're like, this is not gonna find the a place in the ocean with that it just makes completely sense and no one cares about it, and you can put wind turbines there. Funny way of thinking. I skipped over. That was one of the contents we were told to include was a series of maps that looked for areas with high potential for renewable energy and minimal adverse impacts. And we, at the WICMAC, had good debates on the difference between minimal and minimum, but I won't go into those now. But that's how we tried to fulfill that mandate. And so we concluded basically that you're going to have to do this case by case. At the same time, like midway through, if not sooner, when we were doing this, we were being told that the economics was 30 years away. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, there is a possibility. It is possible to be too proactive. That's what I looked at. So I don't want to say why we were doing this, but it kind of became less pressing and not to diminish what we did, but I think we'll trying to explain what comes next. The next slide, please, Zoe. And so, long story short, what we did and this is just the fishing-based mandates from our legislature. You could talk about others, but with this committee's focus on fishing, this is a good way of thinking through how this might work. And you can see here, and I think if you go to the next slide, I might have pulled up some language. It's easier to read, but we have this fishery use protection standard that says it puts the burden on applicants to demonstrate that the projects don't have likely long-term significant adverse effects on fisheries, and that they've taken all reasonable steps to avoid and minimize social and economic impacts to fishing. And so that's an enforceable policy. You can see the document there that was approved by NOAA and it's part of our coastal zone management program. And I think we click one more time, please. And these impacts were defined to be direct, indirect, or cumulative. Direct is removing of fishing grounds, but then, as we've heard a couple times already, like from Steve and Rufus, this also includes these what you do to the habitat or in the ocean and upwelling has the potential to harm the fishing as well. Okay, so I'm trying to leave good time for question and answers. And if you could go just quickly, so you and what the legislature gave us no new authorities to do this. So a lot of this comes from our Ocean Resources Management Act, which it comes from, you can see it was enacted in 1989, and I think followed from some oil spills that happened off the coast, and Casey will have to, if you have questions, explain the details more on this, but this is and Michelle, I remember Michelle bringing this, was one of the topics to the forefront of our discussions early on in marine spatial planning, but it has these criteria that you go through. And you can see that it doesn't, if new uses, it says there should be no likely significant adverse impacts to the marine resources, and then all reasonable steps are taken to avoid and minimize environmental impacts. And then same thing for fishing, recreation, tourism. So this law has been in place for a long time, but Casey will have to correct me that I think it only became an enforceable policy when the marine spatial plan was completed. And then next slide, please. And then this comes from that second era when in the Biden administration when offshore wind really became the emphasis of the administration. And this is their process. And I have to admit, I don't remember seeing this the whole time we were coming up with the marine spatial plan. We could probably talk for 45 minutes just about this slide and how our how our Coastal Zone Management Act enforceable policies would play into this or not. I think I'm gonna run out of time if I try to do it, but there's basically two spots where the states, as you all probably know, have consistency review under the CZMA, and it comes at the leasing stage, which is just only authorizes certain activities like surveying of the sites and putting out new offshore buoys, and then at the construction operation phase, which is way late in the process when everyone thinks it's, a lot of people suspect it's way too late for the no action alternative to ever be possible kind of thing. And again, I can't articulate it all right now, but for our enforceable policies to work, I think just say you get to this point where there's a construction operation phase and we're like, yep, that's gonna have a significant impact on fishing. Everyone's, and it's not a complete veto, but it does carry a lot of weight in the federal system. So to wait to that stage would be a waste of everyone's time. It's kind of the short way of saying it. But how do we fit that kind of thing into the planning analysis stage, which if I'm reading this right, which I've only looked at it a million times, but still have trouble reading if it's like less than a year they have for this planning analysis. when our marine spatial plan, we really wanted the goal was kind of try to front load most of this into the planning analysis phase, which is where you pick the actual sites, which is one of the more important decisions on impacts might happen. Okay, and sorry, that's I just jumped in, but we have this process as part of the management framework, and our group, the Intergovernmental Policy Group, is actually named as helping run this process. Kind of mentioned, like our plan really would like cumulative impacts analysis done, before the lease stage happens, and our plan incorporates the regulations from the NEPA regulations, which are, President Trump recently took away the authority for those, which I learned that they only got the authority because President Carter gave it to him by executive order. But so now I'm kind of wondering where those, what the status of those cumulative impacts, especially with the new Supreme Court case with the oil trains and how far down the tracks do they have to care. So I think someone mentioned already, like there's so much change in what NEPA is going to require potentially that still raising a lot of questions. And then I might just fly through this next part, which is the just kind of storytelling of what's happened in our state, and like skipping a lot of stuff that's happened in California and Oregon related. And next slide here is just so yes, we did this plan, finished it in 2018. We're like, okay, we're never going to need that thing until I retire. And then, surprise, surprise, September 2021, a developer goes public with a project they did not submit, but they were working with members of the Cornell, and they did that, didn't end up getting the Cornell. Once it went through their council, probably decided not to go forward with that, but it did, as you'll see if we have time, bring some new information to light that wish we would have had it when we were doing the marine spatial plan kind of thing. And then we got 2 unsolicited leases requests off Washington. Boom, got them off of Washington, spring and summer of 2022. Our WICMAC formed an offshore wind committee. They worked on this principal engagement, was kind of really reacting to how fast BOEM was moving in the other states. And this, it led Governor Inslee to hire a consultant to study this. Then that study happened in the beginning, first half of last year. They came up with some recommendations in September. Based on those recommendations, maybe I'll have you skip 2 slides or a few slides ahead. Actually, sorry, I'm going too fast here, but just quickly, this is what we learned back in September of 2021. We always knew the National Marine Sanctuary was there, but I didn't have time to change the slides. So you can't put the turbines in the sanctuary without a lot of extra stuff. But what we didn't know was the Department of Defense was the developers did a lot of talking with the Department of Defense, and I think the Biden administration told the Department of Defense to start talking to offshore wind developers more. So we have this flight path thing here, which is that gray elbow thing where planes come in low and fast and do high speed turns. And the Navy was saying we're not going to give that up. So good luck kind of thing. And so if you go one more slide. These were hard to see. These were withdrawn and not on the internet anymore, so I couldn't get better in graphics, but you can see the second unsolicited lease is shallower and like 400 square miles. This Trident Winds one, which was followed from the one that Cornell decided not to move forward with. And if you go to the next slide, you might see it better. But if you can imagine that gray flight path, you can see that blue, that's what they're proposing. It that hugs up right against that, with a little arm going into like where they weren't going to put turbines, but would have some kind of other infrastructure. So that was a big constraint on where we thought offshore would go. I'll go through the next couple slides quickly. This is one of the neater things I think BOEM's produced. If you haven't seen it, it's an atlas of all the submarine canyons, which I never realized until you could see Washington. We have a lot of canyons. Oregon has almost none, or none when you get past Astoria. but the area they're looking at was also very, if you can click to the next slide, please. You know, has a lot of these, canyons where we're told, I forget what it is, 10% slope, they can't anchor it in or something like that. So they're working with a lot of these natural constraints too. Next slide, please. So you can see that's where that Trident Winds, request was. So you can see where we're really limited to, you know, if we really were gonna focus in on planning for offshore wind, this is what you're gonna have to deal with. And it's basically as you get deeper, the less impact you're gonna have on fishing, and it's gonna be hard to avoid a significant impact on fishing if you're on the continental shelf. I think you can go next slide, please. And then I think tomorrow before lunch, Coast Guard is presenting on pack cars, and if you click one more time, if these prohibit, or I still don't fully understand what these do and don't do, but basically I think they prohibit fixed structures and these fairways. It's kind of hard to see like one of those illusions of you're looking at the rabbit or whatever, but the yellow, that basically if these things went into place, that yellow area is pointing out the one area where there would be, you know, it would be possible to put fixed structures in that area. So with all this new information, it seems like you don't really need to do a comprehensive plan of the Washington coast if you were trying to figure out where it'd be feasible to put wind turbines. And like, start running out of time here, but this is just that principal engagement, which I encourage you to look at. But this is the state agencies are a member of the WICMAC, but as well, but we can kind of step back and let the stakeholders speak for themselves, and you can see the frustration they've had with what they perceive to be a lack of transparency with the BOEM process and it going too fast. And then this is just the GridWorks recommendations, the consultant, which I will leave my editorial comments on for now. And then next slide. This is basically the governor, and maybe click one more time, saying that more work needs to be done before we ask BOEM to plan with us for offshore wind. It's part of the reasoning was it's not economically competitive with other low, you know, zero emission resources in our state. The first paragraph really emphasized, you know, Governor Inslee's was climate change was a big focus of his, and needing and green energy was it, but I think we've had our economic studies that the state did or participated in, were saying you're not going to need offshore wind in Washington until like every car on the freeway is electric kind of thing. So the economics wasn't showing a great need for it either. And I think just a couple more slides here. What the governor did do was put in some provisos in our budget. And if you click through these, I'll just have to talk to him quickly. But there's one just saying, hey, the governor's other position was, hey, we maybe not off our state, but if it's going to go off California and elsewhere, you know, Puget Sound in particular is well suited to be part of the supply chain. So there was money to study that. There's actually quite a bit of money for tribal capacity, but not just for offshore wind, but for a bunch of things that, like someone brought up, that tribes are asked, you know, to participate in a lot of stuff, and their staff, you know, they just don't have all the staff to do that. So this, you know, meant to help with that. And then these, I think we two things, basically review your enforceable policies, and then do a research plan where the other two provide those. And skipping to the end, basically it made it into our legislatures, passed the budget, and then we got a new governor this year, and we're facing a tough budget climate. And so Governor Ferguson vetoed those basically because of the financial constraints, but because the timing was less pressing given the new administration's stance on offshore wind. So that, like, what's next? The very last slide, just that I don't think the state's going to stop completely working on this, and Casey could speak to it, but Ecology just led a data gaps analysis of not just offshore wind related, but what you know, in our marine spatial planning area, you know, what are the data gaps we have? And they have this coastal zone management draft strategy, which they haven't finalized yet, but you can see two of the strategies. you know, would be relevant to the kind of the work that providers were asking for. Just, you know, be done without the extra money and obviously, you know, less intensively. And that's the last line. I'm glad I didn't say I would leave 15 minutes for questions because there's only 5 left. Apologies for that. But yeah, I only covered maybe a, you know, pretty narrow slice of what we've talked about it since, you know, and it started before 2010. I don't remember 2008, 7. They were even talking about doing this. So it's been a long time.
Great, thank you, Corey. A lot of information presented, but appreciate the overview of the state marine spatial cleanup. Do we have any questions for Corey or Casey?
That was very informative. Thank you for your presentation. Since part of our charge as a committee is to make recommendations to BOEM, I'm wondering if, from your perspective, you can provide, you know, what you know, if you could wave a magic wand and say, here's how we change the process to allow states, you know, to have their input. You know, would it come earlier in the process? Would it come more often in the process? What would you recommend be altered?
Yeah, I'm thinking that, you know, Steve and Mike Conroy, you know, will have some of these, I have to say, you know, I'm coming at this from a, you know, trying to come at this from the policy neutral stance of, you know, here's how you analyze your decision, and this will all be made under administrative, you know, procedures act, that kind of stuff. But I think what's really, and Ruth said about the, you know, contrasting the NEPA document they had to do for their whaling versus what BOEM does. It's the same thing kind of happens in the fisheries management world of, you know, the heart, you know, all these regulations are out the window now, but, you know, the heart of NEPA being comparing and contrasting alternatives based on the difference of their environmental consequences. That's kind of what isn't transparent in BOEM's process. They go from this, they might actually be doing it, but it doesn't look like it to people. They pick these huge call areas and then they whittle down, but like they don't compare this area versus that area in a way that's easy for people to understand. I'm like, would this have worse impacts? Or, you know, what are the trade-offs between these areas? So I think if they were to do it in a way that, you know, I think a lot of our stakeholders look to the Pacific Fishing Management Council processes, you know, a transparent, like where all deliberations happen in public and we do these compare alternatives. So I think, like, how can you do that in this planning process? I think that's what our new spatial plan would be asking them to do. And yeah, just going too fast, you're never gonna help with that, the understanding. And, you know, they've done stuff in Oregon like this. I forget what they call it, the NCOS, fancier way of spatial, you're looking at spatial optimization. I don't even understand what they did. Be very waiting. So yeah, can you get to this? Can you compare areas? And I like that, like Steve and others will tell you that there's fundamental questions that folks won't answer even before that about what can happen to the California current as a whole. And yeah, I'm glad you got Steve, Mike, and Michelle and others on this who've heard all these discussions that are with Mac, and you'll get a much better, fuller answer from them than I can give you now. And I should say, Casey, I don't know if I should have said Casey was here to answer questions.
Yeah, we have a couple other questions, but Casey, did you want to add anything right now?
No, for the sake of time, I think Corey did a good job there. We can try to answer other questions if people have them.
Great, thanks. We have Mike Conroy and then Rebecca Lewison.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Michelle. And thanks, Corey, for being there. Sorry, I missed the opportunity to see the location. I just wanted to thank you for coming and giving this presentation. It's quite thorough. The question that you were just asked is the question that I was going to ask. You know, particularly expanding upon that, you know, looking at the cumulative impacts part of it. I think you referenced it earlier in your presentation, but that's one of the things that, you know, we've kind of all harped on is, you know, it's one thing to look at the potential impacts of the 2 lease sites off of Humboldt in isolation, but when you start looking at what's planned off Oregon and what could be planned off Washington, looking at and Corey, you know this, the Department of Energy's topologies forecasting out potential offshore wind development. If you can just really briefly speak to the, how that cumulative impacts analysis should have been accounted for, or in the future should be accounted for. And then I'll be quiet. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Now, you have a better way of answering the previous question, but, yeah, BOEM, I guess, first up, BOEM takes and maybe it's not just them, but a really narrow view of what's reasonably foreseeable. In terms of cumulative impacts, it's like, if there's not a lease for it, then it doesn't exist. And so, yeah, like Mike, you referenced that study, but they're looking at transmission line options where they're kind of laying out the way you do like of scenarios off of Oregon, Washington, California. I forget how many gigawatts was, but would someone look at that and figure out would the cumulative effect be such that it has these concerns on the ecosystem or not? And just in the other way of like, how would you improve the process? It just doesn't seem logical to most people. Where how much do people pay for these leases? The one in New York was, New Jersey was millions and millions, and California
1.1.
And so to get to like have them pay that, and then you get to a point where like, oh, you're kind of wreck the ecosystem. Sorry, you can't do this. Like maybe you should have done that, sooner before all that money was spent. It's kind of, I think, the logic of a lot of people. It seems way too late. Way too many resources have been spent when you haven't, taken up some of these questions of, and I honestly don't know how serious to be concerned about some of these questions, but I understand people haven't even looked at them seriously, except for maybe that one place in New England area, which National County did a report on, which, I'm gonna butcher the conclusion of basically you're not gonna really know until you put these in the water and you've been monitoring. So yeah, it's just a lot of could you do more of these analyses up front before all those resources are given? And I don't know if the VCs get their money back if their construction operation plan is turned down, but even so, that's a lot of money putting out there for figuring no reason.
I think my question on follow-up, and I hope we're not circling back on something, but so we've had presentations like yours from California and Oregon, and my question is still, I'm like, okay, wait, so do you feel like the state process sufficiently covers all of those steps and what's missing is what's happening outside of it? Or do you feel like there's things that also need to change in terms of the intra, what happens in Washington and also what happens when you're talking to vets? Like you were saying, how this process should go in terms of comparing sites, and like you have clearly the detailed marine by the state of Washington, the very thorough and detailed marine spatial planning. Does that all have this? It's just not being followed?
Yeah, well, I think that we never got, this was all proactive when we were doing it. We never got hit with the real world BOEM process that California and Oregon did. So I don't know how it actually play out if our governor said, yeah, go do it. How would we have been able to do it better on the timeline? I don't know. Those regulations are pretty rigid. So I think, there's a lot. We were actually a slide I skipped was where one of those budget providers said, do some scenario planning, like tabletop exercises where you play this out and see how it works and how are the steps. The other thing, no one really understood this with Mac. There was just so much other discussion that no one really tried to figure out how this would work. So long way, I don't know what it is, but like the way it happened in California, maybe more happened behind the scenes, but it seemed all of a sudden it was just like, boom, there's the Morro Bay area. So people, and then off Oregon, they were talking, but yeah, people were taken by surprise, and Mike and Steve and Michelle could, fill you in on more of those reactions we've had, but it was, from our stakeholders, universal reaction is too fast, and the consequences are too big. But yeah, so the longest, I think we could have, that first part of that rainbow color graph was where we'd have to really work it out. to fit within BOEM's regulations. And they do seem to have a lot of discretion on how long and how they do that, and they sat on those unsolicited lease requests in a way I don't understand how they have the authority to do that. But yeah, there's a lot we wanted to learn and work with BOEM, and, you know, in Washington, the tribal co-management even adds more to the tribe. As Stephen Rupert said, they're wanting to be involved in the Morro Bay process, so, there's have to be a lot to be figured out.
Who's going? Thanks, Casey.
And the feel better Casey's just not telling me I got it all wrong. So.
Thanks. No, Corey, you did a great job. I guess if I have a moment, the one thing that I would add is kind of emphasizing that I do think BOEM and the federal government could do a much better job of looking at these as a region. And we've heard this over and over again, but like the California current ecosystem connects all of us. And so impacts in California can be seen in Washington and vice versa. And BOEM has been pretty rigid about expanding a programmatic EIS to look at the West Coast. But, when we're talking about these big systems and upwelling and all the potential impacts, I think a more holistic, larger planning area could be really helpful to answer these outstanding questions that I think keep a lot of people up at night. But I'll leave it there and just say thanks, Corey. Great job.
Thank you, Casey. Thanks, Corey. If we, our next speaker is Sean Fribble, who's going to be presenting on the legal framework of the offshore renewable energy development process.
What do we have set up though?
I have your slides. Do you want me to share them?
Yeah.
Talking to her.
I think.
Thank you. So just a brief introduction for those who I have not met. Sean Cribble. I'm with the law firm Holland and Knight. I'm based in Washington, DC. We're a law firm of about 2,200 lawyers. Offices around the world. We just opened a Seattle office, actually. So very excited to be out here. I don't know if you have my bio or not, but I'll keep it condensed. So I've been in the maritime sector for about 30 years. Graduated Kings Point, sailed on ships for about 8 years, was a Coast Guard JAG after law school, then worked for another law firm doing the same type of practice I have now, which is maritime and international trade and energy. I then spent 2 years in Norway working for a P&I club, which is kind of a marine insurer for ship owners. And then returned about 4.5 years back to join Holland and Knight in DC. Relevant here, I spent 6 years as a Marine Board member, which was fantastic. Through that process, I have participated as a committee member on 2 study committees. So I have a real respect and understanding for what you're going through and appreciate the chance to come out and present on this topic, which is a lot of what I do. So I'm a regulatory lawyer primarily. And this is a really fascinating area for me because, as we'll talk about, it really gets into, it's one of the most complex areas, I think, is the offshore sector, especially with emerging areas like offshore renewables. This is because it's new, it's emerging. This is why there's a committee looking at this. There's really no limit to the ideas that are being presented as to what the maritime domain can be used for to support offshore renewables. but that all adds complexities. So let's go ahead. So this is my standard caveat here, just that this is a disclaimer. I'm here to provide educational information. This is not legal advice. Part of what I framed this presentation as is really, again, having been through these committee processes. We got about 45 minutes. I'm going to try to leave some time for questions at the end. But this is more high level legal framework of the types of laws that may be applicable as you examine these various issues. It's meant to be a resource, so not a lot of pictures. I don't have really cool slides with graphs and things like that. But you can use these slides later as reference. Any lawyers on the committee? I don't remember. Okay, there you go. So you'll be busy. Yeah. So that was one thing I found in the two committees that I worked with, they were very heavily focused on legal authorities, and it did require quite a bit of just analysis, of just understanding what's at play. Let's bring the next slide. I think what's really interesting is, I know there's a focus on offshore wind. I think, the idea of floating offshore winds, really, a West Coast idea more than where I am on the East Coast. Of course, they're not really floating because they're attached to the seabed, so it's a little bit, I think, of a confusing term. But offshore wind, obviously, that's primarily what we're looking at here. But there's also a number of different, which I understand also you're looking at offshore renewables. I did just take a quick look at the previous meetings. I think this is meeting 5. So I did a quick look to see what you've received so far. I didn't go through every presentation, but I just wanted to know what has been covered already. I'm not going to do the deep dive that the people from BOEM, Bessie, and whoever else is going to provide to you. They're going to be the experts on how their internal processes work. But I want to give you an idea of what are they relying on when it comes to those statutory authorities. I think what's really been interesting, both in the US but also overseas, are some of the other ideas. So, floating tidal energy conversion. I mean, these are things that have been around for a while. We're seeing them in different places around the world. Wave energies, solar energy, hydrokinetic, and floating ocean thermal energy converters. Does anyone have experience with that last one? Okay, so are you familiar that they have this statute back, and I think it was around the 80s or so, and then they promulgated regulations and they pulled those regulations out. So that was the last that I've seen of formal regulatory frameworks for something that's kind of novel like this. The US government in terms of US statute, and that was the reason that they pulled the regulations back was they had like an open comment period where they were receiving submissions to see about people investing in that, and no one expressed an interest, and so they essentially withdrew those regulations. Okay, next. So this is just an example. You've probably already seen this already, or you have this on your agenda, but I think this is what makes it so interesting. There could be others here that I haven't identified, and please, flag them if you can. But obviously, Bessie and BOEM, FERC, Coast Guard. I think you're getting a presentation from the Coast Guard tomorrow. The Army Corps, DOD, Fish and Wildlife, NOAA, and then state agencies. Who could be involved? I think it's just, you're looking at the 3 states here, but I didn't know if Alaska was also part of your West Coast analysis. So this is really interesting because here we have all these agencies. They all have, some inherent statutory authorities that they rely on that gives them the authority to regulate. And in many cases, you have overlapping jurisdiction, and that requires coordination. That's something depends on how you look at it. Either they do it really well or not. I've been in the federal government, so I understand that interagency cooperation side with the Coast Guard and who we worked with on a daily basis. I know it's complex, I know it's complicated, so hopefully I can help offer some insight on this. Next slide. So this is what else to me is really interesting about offshore renewable energy. The number of considerations that just exist a bit outside of traditional maritime or energy spaces. So cultural sites, so we had this was an interesting part of my role with the Deepwater Horizon. So, you know, sunken burial grounds, things like that, cultural sites, sunken wrecks, things like that, you know, things that have to be preserved somehow. Fisheries, I think we just heard on that, I'm sure we get quite a bit, that's a, you know, big part of this conversation, historic properties, migratory species, Native American interests, I know tribal interest is part of this. Navigation, maritime commerce, I'll touch on that. That's obviously a big part of what you're looking at. Protected species, offshore habitats, recreation, tourism, national security, power grid. So power grid, so, you know, how does it connect? What are the capabilities? What are the considerations with that? What's the impact on the power grid? This is something that's come up in the offshore wind context, as we can build a lot of wind, but is the grid ready to receive it? And if not, what does that mean? So, okay. All right, so I just want to kind of give this kind of a legal authorities 101 here. So as you go through your study, and again, I don't know exactly what has been discussed in the previous 4 meetings and how you're going about your committee task. But just to kind of break it down, these are some of the legal authorities that could impact some of your decision, because ultimately you're going to be making recommendations, is my understanding. And so, you know, looking at what applies in what case. So is there a treaty that the US has that somehow impacts the offshore sector? I guess you could look at UN Convention Law of the Sea. That's when we're not a party to it, but we recognize certain aspects of it as customary international law. But that's just one example. Statute, that's really, I think, where a lot of this is gonna live. You know, what statutes? I went through, as you saw, a number of different agencies that all have their own statutory authorities. Tribal law, how that intersects with federal law and state law. Regulations that implement the statutes and give that guidance to the regulated industries as to what they need to do to begin a new OR project. Executive orders, so we'll touch on one of those, and I think one of your prior presentations had a reference to the offshore wind executive order. Foreign law, so is there any foreign law that you have to be aware of? So what about a foreign country that has maybe a foreign flag vessel or some type of a foreign registered device that wants to come into US waters and they want to establish some type, you know, is there some type of foreign law that could apply, whether it's a flag state jurisdiction, something like that? Agency legal opinions, so sometimes you're lucky enough for an agency to actually publish their interpretation of their statute and their authorities. What do those say? What does that say about how they looked at precedent? A big part of this, and one of my slides will list a lot of these, but memorandum of understanding and memorandum of agreement, MOU, MOA. That's an example again of how agencies have come together to essentially reach agreements on how, in cases of overlapping jurisdiction, they're going to divide up responsibilities and processes. But those are really important to look at too. And then lastly, policy guidance. There has been quite a bit published on how agencies, again, how they interpret statutes, how they interpret regulations, that's guidance both to the agency itself, but then also to industry. And you can just see here, I'm sorry, this is just one example of the regulation. And I'm not sure if you have like an authorities list that you're preparing, but this one is on renewable energy and alternate uses of existing facilities on the OCS, the bottom row there. That goes back to the old MMS. All right, so we'll just start with states. This is not my expertise because I'm not licensed in Washington, Oregon, or California. So I don't deal as much with it, but I do deal with people that are licensed there. So just to give an understanding of how, in my experience, in the offshore sector, where we see primarily two authorities that focus on, I guess it'll change out that skin.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're fine, I just go back to that. So just to, once again, these are things that you may have already looked at because we're at meeting 5 already. But states play an important regulatory role with offshore renewable energies. This is something that's likely, given the scope of the task here. But what are states focused on? They're focused on their protection of resources and habitats projects in state waters. So transmission cables, I think, is one that's really important to consider. So if you have that, maybe it starts in the federal waters and then comes into state waters, how is that going to work with state regulatory bodies? Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, this is something just to have as you work through these processes. That is essentially helps establish the criteria and standards for local implementation, water use planning regulation development. But again, it's this idea of states and federal authorities working together to permit these projects, and it's because of that natural intersection of the power coming into the states by way of transmission cables or whatever it may be, you're going to probably have that intersection. You also could just have projects that are solely in state waters. This is what Louisiana looked at doing. I don't know if you had anyone talk about this, but they were trying to develop offshore wind in the state of Louisiana, just in Louisiana waters, because they were trying to not get into the federal framework. So they were trying to they built an enormous pier down in the port of, I think it's near Fouchon. So that's just an example of how states have been addressing these offshore matters. The Submerged Land Act, this was a very important piece of legislation that essentially assured the coastal states control over the lands beneath the waters. The main takeaway with this and then with the prior slide also is that state waters generally go out to 3 nautical miles. There's a little caveat there that within the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, and the Gulf Coast of Florida actually go to 9 miles. But Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, they're also 3 miles. So for your purposes here on the West Coast, they're all 3 miles. So just to bear in mind when you're working through, just to think, and I'll finish all this at the end with a way to help you kind of work through the process that I work through when a question comes up of jurisdiction. So states can also regulate coastal waters within their jurisdiction for matters related to commerce, navigation, coastal defense. But the other issue is, looking at this idea of, is the activity preempted by federal law? So generally speaking, just using the example as a former Coast Guard Jack, so maritime commerce in the context of vessel regulation that's affecting interstate commerce is likely preempted and reserved to the U.S. Coast Guard for their, now within states, you will have states have authorities for boats here for state registration, things like that. But generally speaking, when it comes to interstate commerce, that's usually reserved for the federal government. But you want to look and see, and again, at the end, we'll talk through some ways to do this, but what is the activity being regulated and is there a question of that already being preempted by the federal government? And then at the end there, so essentially we're talking about 3 miles for state waters, and then outside of that's going to be federal waters. Right, next slide. And as I'm going through this, feel free to ask questions as well. We don't have to wait for the end, but We're okay. This is probably the most important statute, here, the Outer, Continental Shelf Lands Act. This extended jurisdiction, and just want to be very precise here, so we're talking about installations and other devices that are attached to the seabed for the purpose of exploring for, developing, or producing resources, including non-mineral energy resources. So each of these is really important terms, I understand, but this is what gives the federal government now the authority to go out essentially to 200 nautical miles. And this, the jurisdiction though that this applies to the ocean floor, to the seabed, but not necessarily to those waters in between unless it is attached. So the key consideration then is looking at whether or not that device, that installation, whatever you want to call it, whether that's attached to the seabed for purposes of, and then as you see here in 2021, the OXLA was extended to non-mineral resources for the purposes of offshore wind. So it's prior word only really refer to oil and gas and other minerals. But 2021, they saw the need Congress saw the need that they needed to add non-mineral for the purposes of offshore wind. That has created, this idea of non-mineral. Still, once again, we talked about floating offshore wind, which is itself still attached. So you get there under the OXLA then when you're within federal waters out to 200 nautical miles on the OCS, when it's attached to the seabed for those purposes that we've talked about. I see you're kind of nodding your head. Are you thinking it goes beyond 200 or the extended continental shelf or?
No.
Okay, I didn't know if there is an extended continental shelf also. But for purposes here, we're primarily talking about 200 nautical miles out. So that's just really important. This is what will guide a lot of the analysis on the OCS, and because this is what gives that federal government the authority for this. But you have to look really closely to see, are these elements being met? I would say this is the second most important, the Energy Policy Act 2005. This was important for helping define the legal and regulatory framework for issuance of permits for offshore development in the territorial sea and the OCS. Again, this amended the OXLA to establish this legal authority for federal review and approval for offshore energy related projects. This is primarily for the Secretary of the Interior, so DOI, then through them Bessie Bohm. But this was really important for granting leases, easements, rights of ways for certain activities that were not authorized by other relevant statutes. And it authorized considerable regulatory regulation of impacts associated with offshore development. So the Energy Policy Act, this gets us now into beyond just what the device is doing on the OCS, but then that power transmission. I think there was a reference to NEPA in the last one. I think there's probably several people here that are very familiar with this. But just to flag, the NEPA review has become this enormous part of offshore wind. And just to highlight here that this is an important part of any offshore renewable energy developments, primarily with preparation of an environmental impact statement, and the guidance here that I've included is this DOI guidance on alternative energy development and production and the alternate use of facilities on the OCS. So I've just included these in here. You can go to these links later. And again, please tell me if you have already heard all of this before. Okay, great. So this is really important. And I think this is something The environmental impact statements is something that we're hearing more and more about because there is an international convention that's trying to look at this closer, that would go beyond 200 miles. That's kind of referred to as this high seas convention. But I think that this is something that will continue, obviously, to be very important. So the Army Corps, they also have a role to play here in the Rivers and Harbors Act. So their jurisdiction is related to permitting obstructions to navigation within the navigable water. So this relates primarily within 3 miles, but just when you look at specific questions, just bear in mind if there's there could be a role for the Army Corps to play if there's some type of a device or installation that could be seen as an obstruction. Just imagine just like you're on these waterways, if someone wants to build something right in the middle of it, there could be some role for the Army Corps to play in terms of permitting processes. So it just adds another layer of consideration. I think these the Endangered Species Act and other statutes that relate to marine life, I think are really challenging. And here, just to flag, I think some of the most important ones, but the ESA, the idea here is that it prohibits any person from taking an endangered species. So I put taking in quotation marks because what does that mean? It doesn't necessarily mean to go and pick up and actually physically take something. It has a much broader definition, which is harassing, harming, pursuing, hunting, shooting, wounding, kill, trap, capture, collect, or attempt to engage in any such conduct. Takings are really interesting. I've dealt with several cases that have involved this because of how agencies interpret this. I mean, so it's obviously drafted really broadly, and they look at it very broadly. So is there any type of, I mean, I kind of look at it as an interference, you know, so is there something that's being done that's interfering to the extent that it's causing this harm to some type of an endangered species? So obviously this will require some level of consultation to understand whether or not these species is in fact endangered, and then also that just ensuring that actions are not jeopardizing these listed species. So once again, it's just another layer of complexity that goes into analyzing a respective project. In a similar vein, the Marine Mammal Protection Act, again, where this prohibits taking marine mammals in U.S. waters and persons and vessels subject to U.S. jurisdiction on the high seas. So the actual definition refers to vessels, but that in quotation mark because a question you may have to ask when you're going through different proposals, whatever it may be, when you're analyzing your recommendation is whether or not it's a vessel. And that is defined by statute. And so looking at whether a device, whatever it may be, does that meet that definition of a vessel? Because a number of statutes will refer to vessels, but they won't include everything else. So in my view, if it's not a vessel, then you stop. Then you don't go further with the analysis. And that's part of the limitation and complexity with offshore operation. Where does it fit? And we'll talk about this later, but when you come into a statute that reads as applying to a specific type of instrument or a device or a vessel, then you really have to look and see, does that apply very narrowly or can it be interpreted more broadly? Okay, thanks. Again, another animal related, the Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This, as the name implies, but once again relates to migratory birds. It's primarily implementing U.S. obligations with treaties with Canada, Japan, Mexico, Russia. Mentioned earlier the idea of treaty obligations. Once again, prohibits taking, then a little bit broader in terms of killing, possession, transportation of trafficking, migratory birds, etc. So this is something that the government has published guidance on in the context of wind energy turbine blades, and is a part of that analysis as well. So once again, you start with looking at does that species of bird fit within this migratory definition, then to see is that a consideration that's being taken into account in terms of the actual operation that's being undertaken. On the fisheries side, the Magnuson-Stevens Fishery Conservation Management Act. This is a federal program that is intended for the conservation and management of fishery resources, primarily to prevent overfishing, to rebuild overfished stocks, and to facilitate long-term protection of special fish habitats. This is something that the U.S. Coast Guard is very focused on also. So this is something and I'm not going to get into too much into the lane of the fishery side, because I know you're going to have specific presentations on that, like you just had. So this is just, once again, this is another consideration as to what the developer has to look at when they're citing for a potential project. Coast Guard, I know we have at least one other Coast Guard from across the end in the room.
There's more than one.
Oh, more than one. How many do we have? All right, how many do we have? Just show of hands. How many coasties and former coasties do we have? Okay. So, very broad authority, around 11 missions. You ask Admiral Allen, he'll say it's more than 11. But really interesting because they are both a primary regulator, but they also do a lot with cooperation and collaboration with other agencies. In the context of offshore renewable energy, it's really limited in the context of regulating the facilities or the vessels or the navigation, which I know that's a primary consideration here. So I just put some of the citations here of the statutes, but also some of the work instructions. Just recommend if you have someone from the Coast Guard who's coming, they may be able to point to more current, but I only have access to what's in open source. So you can see here that they do have regulations and statutes that look at markings of artificial islands, installations, or devices as part of the tasking here. I'm not sure if you're looking at recommendations to the Coast Guard of whether those authorities are sufficient or whether changes need to be made, but that's primarily what, so essentially safety focus. So first of all, do they have the authority? Has, Congress given them the authority to regulate a certain operations, whether it's mandating certain lights on an offshore installation, mandating some type of warning, radar reflectors, whatever it may be. So primarily safety, that's the first one. But then also they do have authority for safety as well as security. So if it's closer to shore, they do have the ability also just to look and see, is there any type of a security risk posed by some installation that's being installed. But really they're focused on, here's a few sites related to renewable energy on the OCS. Just to have for your reference, their inspection authority for OCS facilities that are fixed. And then some instructions here on marine planning and maintaining the marine transportation system. So they're primarily focused on safety of the property of people and the environment. So they're focused on ensuring safe navigation, for example, and navigation routes. But again, limited to what Congress has authorized them to do. And this is something that the Coast Guard's been looking at for a number of years is, do they have enough authority, essentially when it comes to offshore renewable energy, because, Congress has not given them all the authority to take some of the steps that they've mentioned that they may want to take. So for now, they're just limited to these, but, they do offer some, guidance documents on navigation, safety risk assessments, and planning guides for waterways. So, when, I think tomorrow you have the cluster coming, I'm not sure if you have other meetings, but these are, types of authorities that they may be able to offer more, commentary on, as well as where they stand as an agency on the offshore development. Okay. I won't go too far into the, tribal laws, but just want to point out that there are executive orders that specifically look at Indian sacred sites and consultation with the tribal governments. So just to be aware that there is, some guidance out there for you on how the federal government looks to work with the tribal governments. And then also, this is again, another resource here, with renewable energy, just with the flag that there are specific regulations out there that have looked exactly at, some of these issues. I think in one of your prior presentations, you had this discussion on the executive order on the temporary withdrawal of all areas on the offshore continental shelf with offshore wind leasing. Very long title here, and review of the federal government's leasing and permitting practices for wind projects. So it's just worth monitoring over the scope of your committee here. What's in place right now, which is still in force. But just to monitor, I mean, for someone like myself in Washington DC, I now am on about a minute by minute monitoring of what's happening. And it can turn very quickly. So I would just continue to monitor, throughout this, whether there's new executive orders that are promulgated, because they can change everything just like that. So some of the, key things with this, or at least one key thing is, looking very closely to parse out the language in this executive order and what it's actually saying in terms of the pause and, the distinction between permits that have already been granted, work that's already underway as compared to, new applications. So just looking very closely at this, because there's lots of analysis on this, but the main takeaway here is just to note this is another source of authority that is impacting this scope of this committee.
Sean, do you have any sense of what triggered that guidance or that order, executive order? What were the concerns that?
I would say,
I know that's a loaded question, but.
yeah,